Vanessa Carter Perez didn't even blink when she called me garbage for the first time. We were standing in a ballroom packed with hundreds of people, and I was in my faded navy blue housekeeping uniform, gripping a heavy metal cart stacked with clean linens. She looked at me with this look of absolute disgust and said, loud enough for half the room to hear, "Can someone please get this old piece of trash away from the guests?" People let out these nervous, awkward laughs. My own son, Michael, was standing just a few feet away. He looked right at me, and he didn't say a single word. I just swallowed my pride, looked down at my worn-out shoes, and pushed my cart out of the room. What that woman didn't know, what none of them knew, was that every luxury crystal chandelier hanging above her head, every single dime of the massive paychecks she bragged about, and every piece of her designer lifestyle only existed because of one single signature. And that signature belonged to me. Before we get to the rest of the story, I want you to be completely honest with me. Have you ever been judged or looked down on by someone who had absolutely no clue who you really were? Tell me about it in the comments below, and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I truly love reading your stories. And if these emotional family dramas touch your heart, please take a second to hit that like button and subscribe so we can keep sharing these incredible life journeys together. I live in a small, rundown brick house right on the edge of Chicago. Most of my family likes to pretend this neighborhood doesn't even exist anymore. The paint on my front porch is peeling, the mailbox leans a little to the left whenever the winter wind blows too hard, and the kitchen faucet screeches every single morning when I turn it on to make coffee. But after my husband Richard passed away, luxury just didn't matter to me anymore. In a house this empty, the silence is a lot easier to handle than a bunch of fancy things. Most mornings, I wake up long before the sun even thinks about rising. I pull my graying hair back into a tight, low bun, get into my dented silver Toyota, and make the 15-mile drive into downtown Chicago. By 6:30 a.m., I'm standing inside the grand lobby of the Perez Majestic Hotel, wearing a dark blue uniform with my first name embroidered right above the pocket. Penelope. No last name. That little detail mattered a lot. Nobody in that hotel had any idea that Penelope Perez was the woman who quietly controlled the family trust behind the entire Perez Majestic luxury chain. To the staff, I was just an old lady pushing a laundry cart through corridors lined with Italian marble and gold leaf. To be honest, some days I preferred it that way. When people think you're invisible, they show you exactly who they really are. That particular morning, I was in the basement laundry room folding towels with Angela Brooks. She let out a heavy sigh and rubbed her lower back, wincing a little. "Oh, my knees are absolutely killing me today," she muttered, leaning against one of the massive industrial dryers. "You should really sit down and take a break," I told her gently, keeping my hands moving. Angela laughed, but she shot a nervous glance toward the door, terrified that Vanessa might catch her slacking off. "Oh, goodness, absolutely not. I can't risk it." Just hearing my daughter-in-law's name made something in my chest tighten. Angela had no clue Vanessa was married to my son. Nobody in housekeeping did. I had managed to keep my private life a complete secret from the staff for nearly 3 years. Angela leaned in a little closer, lowering her voice to a whisper. "Have you heard the rumors?" "What rumors?" I asked. "They're talking about restructuring again. Layoffs." I kept folding, smoothing out the edges of a white bath towel. "Who told you that?" "One of the kitchen managers overheard the executives talking upstairs. They want to phase out the older staff first. They're claiming our healthcare costs are just too high for the company to absorb." An icy chill ran down my spine. Richard would have never allowed something like that to happen, and neither would I. The Perez Majestic Hotel Group wasn't built by executives sitting in boardrooms wearing custom-tailored suits. It was built on the backs of exhausted, hard-working people. People like Angela, who missed birthdays and wedding anniversaries, just to make sure the guests had spotless rooms and fresh coffee. People like me. Way back in 1981, Richard and I used a small loan from his uncle and every single penny I had saved from waitressing at a Greasy Spoon diner to open a tiny crumbling motel just outside of San Antonio. I can still remember walking down 2 flights of concrete stairs, carrying heavy piles of stained sheets while I was 7 months pregnant with Michael. Richard would always kiss my forehead and say, "One day, Penny, we're going to build something beautiful." But even after the success came, we never forgot what real bone-deep hard work felt like. At least, Richard never did. Suddenly, a loud burst of laughter echoed from the hallway just outside the laundry room. A second later, Vanessa walked in. She was wearing an off-white designer coat that probably cost more than my entire car. 2 young assistants scurried behind her, holding tablets and cups of expensive coffee. The entire room went dead silent. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Vanessa looked around, making absolutely no effort to hide her disgust, acting as if the mere smell of commercial laundry detergent was a personal insult to her. "Why is it so incredibly hot in here?" she complained, fanning herself with a manicured hand. Nobody answered. Angela stood up straight beside me, adjusting her apron. "Good morning, Mrs. Carter-Perez." Vanessa barely even nodded in her direction. Then her sharp eyes locked onto me. That familiar look immediately washed over her face, a mix of deep annoyance and pure embarrassment. She absolutely hated seeing me there. It wasn't because she cared about my well-being. It was because my presence completely ruined the high society image she was desperately trying to project to the world. "Good grief," she muttered under her breath. She crossed her arms tightly. "You're still doing this?" I offered her a polite, professional smile. "Good morning, Vanessa." One of her assistants looked completely confused, probably wondering why a low-level housekeeper was addressing a top executive by her first name. Vanessa narrowed her eyes. "You missed a major stain on the carpet in the 3rd-floor hallway yesterday." "I'll go back and check it right away," I replied calmly. "You should have checked it right the first time." Her voice wasn't incredibly loud, but it was incredibly sharp, making everyone in the room look down at the floor. Angela took a cautious step forward, trying to defend me. "Actually, Mrs. Perez, that stain happened later in the afternoon when a guest spilled some red wine." "I wasn't speaking to you," Vanessa snapped, cutting her off instantly. Angela's head dropped, her face turning bright red. Something hot flared up inside me. It wasn't anger yet. It was just a deep, exhausting sense of disappointment. Because I still remembered the very first time Michael brought Vanessa home to meet me 6 years ago. Back then, she seemed so nervous, so sweet. She talked about growing up in a tiny town in Texas, about how her parents constantly struggled just to pay the electric bill. She actually cried at my dinner table, telling me how much she wanted to be part of a real, loving family. And I believed her. I guess that was my first mistake. Vanessa looked me up and down one more time, before turning her back to me and addressing her assistants. "We really need to implement a much stricter dress code and appearance standard for the staff," she said carelessly. "This hotel is supposed to represent ultimate luxury." Her eyes drifted pointedly down toward my worn-out orthotics. The assistants let out a pair of synchronized, awkward giggles. I kept my expression completely blank. Years ago, words like that would have broken my heart. But time teaches a woman a very important lesson. Humiliation only has power over you if you accept it. Vanessa turned around to face me again. "And Penelope, please make sure you only use the freight elevator from now on. We've had a few complaints from the high-profile guests." That one actually stung. It wasn't the words themselves, but the fact that she said it in front of the people I worked with every single day. I just nodded. Of course. Satisfied with herself, Vanessa turned on her heel and walked out, her designer heels clicking sharply against the cold tile floor. After she disappeared, the room stayed completely silent for a long time. Finally, Angela let out a breath and whispered, "I'm so incredibly sorry, Penelope. She's just awful to you." I gave her a small, reassuring smile. Some people spend their entire lives trying to make themselves feel important, Angela. Angela studied my face for a moment, looking confused. "You know, you really don't act like any housekeeper I've ever met." I almost laughed out loud, if she only knew the truth. Later that afternoon, during my lunch break, I sat alone in the employee courtyard, holding a paper cup of lukewarm soup. The snow was starting to fall silently onto the city streets. Years ago, I used to have lunch in the executive dining room, rubbing elbows with international investors and politicians. Now I was sitting on a cold metal bench alongside the janitors and the kitchen staff. And the strange thing was, These people felt infinitely more real than any of the wealthy circles Vanessa was so desperately trying to climb into. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was Michael. For a split second, my heart lifted. I answered it immediately. "Hello, sweetheart." His voice sounded distracted, hurried. "Hey, Mom." He said Mom, not Mother. That meant Vanessa wasn't anywhere near him. "Are you coming over for dinner this Friday?" he asked. "I didn't think I was invited," I replied honestly. There was a long, heavy pause on the line. Then he dropped his voice to a low whisper. "Vanessa wants to entertain some major business contacts. It would really mean a lot to me if you could make it." I looked down at the steam rising from my soup. Once upon a time, whenever I went to visit him, Michael would beg me to stay just a little bit longer. Now, even a simple dinner invitation sounded like a business negotiation. "I'll think about it," I said softly. Another silence stretched between us. Then he spoke even softer, sounding completely ashamed. "Mom, if you do decide to come, could you maybe not wear your work uniform?" The line cut deeper than any insult Vanessa could ever throw at me. Because cruelty from a stranger is one thing, but when your own flesh and blood is embarrassed by you, that kind of heartbreak settles right into your bones. After we hung up, I sat on that bench for a very long time, watching the snow pile up against the edge of the courtyard. For the first time in years, I started to wonder if my silence was actually turning into weakness. Friday night was even colder than usual. The freezing Chicago wind was howling between the skyscrapers, biting in my face as I stepped out of my old Toyota. I stood there for a second, looking up at the massive glass luxury tower where Michael and Vanessa lived. Their penthouse was right at the top, glowing with warm golden light against the pitch-black winter sky, looking like a place completely out of reach. Richard used to love architecture like that, not because it was expensive, but because he genuinely admired what human beings could build when they worked together. I pulled my wool coat tightly around myself and walked into the lobby, carefully holding a small homemade peach pie I had baked that afternoon. Michael used to beg me to make it for him every single year on his birthday when he was a little boy. Back then, he would sit on the kitchen counter, swinging his legs and watching me roll out the dough. "Don't let the edges burn, Mum," he'd always tease me. Those memories felt painfully far away now. The elevator ride up to the penthouse was completely silent, except for some soft piano music playing through the hidden speakers. By the time the doors slid open, I could already hear the loud laughter and clinking glasses coming from the main living area. A young female receptionist, dressed in sharp black, greeted me coldly at the door. "You must be Penelope, not Mrs. Perez, just Penelope, right?" I offered her a polite smile. "Good evening." The penthouse looked like something straight out of an architectural magazine. Massive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the sparkling Chicago skyline. The light from a massive crystal chandelier reflected perfectly off the polished marble floors. Every single inch of the place was meticulously designed to impress people. But despite all the beauty, the apartment felt freezing cold. Not physically cold, but emotionally dead. Vanessa appeared a moment later, wearing a tight emerald green designer gown with diamonds glittering around her neck. "Oh," she said, sounding completely disappointed. "You actually made it." I chose to ignore the comment and held out the pie. "I brought some dessert." Vanessa looked down at the pie as if I were handing her a bag of garbage. "Well, isn't that just delightfully homemade?" Before I could even reply, two elegantly dressed couples walked out of the formal dining room. Vanessa's entire demeanor changed instantly, lighting up with artificial warmth. "There she is," one of the wealthy women said. "Vanessa, your apartment is absolutely breathtaking." Vanessa let out a dramatic laugh. "Thank you so much. Honestly, Michael and I barely have any time to actually enjoy it because we practically live at the corporate office." The way she said "my company" made my stomach turn. Michael finally walked out from the hallway, wearing a dark, expensive suit. The exact moment his eyes landed on me, a wave of intense guilt flashed across his face. He whispered. He walked over and gave me a quick, incredibly nervous kiss on the cheek, immediately glancing over at Vanessa to check her reaction. Seeing him act so terrified in his own home gave me a sharp pang of sorrow. Vanessa clapped her hands together lightly to get everyone's attention. "Everyone, this is Michael's mother, Penelope." One of the wealthy men smiled politely. "It's a pleasure to meet you, ma'am. Before I could even say a word, Vanessa casually added, "She handles housekeeping at one of our boutique locations. She just loves keeping herself busy." The energy in the room shifted instantly. The warm smiles turned into pitying nods and awkward glances. It's always so obvious when people are silently calculating your social worth in their heads. I'd seen it 1,000 times before in business, but hearing it come from my own daughter-in-law felt entirely different. One of the women tilted her head symmetrically. "Well, that's certainly admirable. Admirable. It's amazing how cruel that word can sound when it's wrapped in pure pity." I kept my smile perfectly intact. Dinner started shortly after. The formal dining table alone probably cost more than Richard and I earned during our first 2 years of marriage combined. Vanessa sat at the head of the table next to Michael, acting like a queen hosting a group of royal donors. The conversation turned directly to corporate business within minutes. "Our luxury division is absolutely destroying our quarterly projections," Vanessa announced proudly, taking a sip of her wine. "Honestly, the brand elevation strategy has been completely transformative." Michael nodded tiredly, staring at his plate. Vanessa spearheaded the vast majority of that strategy. "Oh, please, I'm practically running the daily operations at this point," she joked carelessly. The table erupted into light laughter. I watched my son closely. Once upon a time, Michael absolutely detested arrogance. When he was just a little boy in elementary school, if another kid forgot their lunch, Michael would automatically give them half of his sandwich. Richard loved that gentle streak in him. But somewhere along the line of growing up, my son had learned a dangerous lesson. That silence was a lot easier than confrontation. Vanessa suddenly turned her sharp gaze to me. "You know, Penelope, we're actually looking into pushing out a completely modernized staffing model across all of our premier properties." I calmly dabbed my mouth with a linen napkin. "What kind of model?" "Image, energy, efficiency," she said, forcing a tight smile. "Our high net worth clientele explicitly do not want to see exhausted, aging staff dragging heavy utility carts through the main guest corridors." Michael shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I looked Vanessa dead in the eye. "It's those exact exhausted workers who built the sterling reputation your high net worth clients are currently enjoying." Vanessa let out a soft, dismissive chuckle. "Well, that's a lovely sentiment, Penelope, but times change." One of the wealthy businessmen raised his wineglass in her direction. "And that is exactly why leadership from the younger generation is so critical for the survival of these brands." Vanessa absolutely beamed under the compliment. Suddenly, a vivid memory of another dinner decades ago flashed into my mind. Richard and I were sitting in the cramped, freezing back office of our very first motel, eating cheap Chinese takeout. Michael was just a tiny baby, sleeping soundly in a plastic laundry basket right next to us because we couldn't even afford a proper crib yet. Richard looked over the meagre financial statements and let out a long sigh. "Penny, if we ever actually make it big, promise me one thing." "What's that, Rich?" I asked. "Promise me we will never, ever become the kind of people who forget where they came from." Back then, I thought keeping that promise would be the easiest thing in the world. Sitting at this table, I wasn't so sure anymore. Vanessa's sharp voice snapped me right back to reality. "To be completely frank," she continued casually, "sometimes I think emotional attachments are the number one thing that destroys a profitable business. You have to be entirely willing to cut away the dead weight." Dead weight. There was that phrase again. I noticed Michael was staring straight down at his silverware, completely motionless. "Some employees," Vanessa said, looking right at me, "stay with a company for way too long simply because people feel guilty about moving on." The message was crystal clear. She wasn't just talking about the staff downstairs, she was talking about me. One of the wealthy ladies leaned in toward Vanessa. "So how exactly do you handle difficult, long-term employees who just won't let go?" Vanessa let out a small, condescending smirk before answering. "You simply remind them that every single person is completely replaceable." In that exact moment, something inside me broke. It wasn't because she insulted me. It was because if Richard were alive to hear our family name associated with that kind of cold, heartless greed, it would have absolutely broken his spirit. I carefully set my fork down onto the expensive china plate. Did you know, I said softly, my voice cutting through the chatter, that when Richard and I opened our very first motel, we personally scrubbed every single toilet ourselves? The entire table went completely quiet. Vanessa kept her polite smile plastered on, looking at me the way someone looks at a senile old relative telling a story nobody cares about. I continued calmly. One winter, our main heating system completely failed during a massive blizzard. Richard didn't sleep for 36 straight hours. He personally carried heavy, portable space heaters up and down the stairs to every single guest room, just to make sure nobody would freeze. Michael finally lifted his head and looked at me. I could see the memory hitting him hard. He used to say, I added, locking eyes with my daughter-in-law, that a business doesn't survive because of the money in the bank. A business survives because the people working the lowest jobs believe that they are truly valued. Vanessa took a slow sip of her wine, completely unfazed. That is a truly beautiful, old-fashioned sentiment, Penelope, she replied smoothly. But modern corporate entities require much tougher, metrics-driven decisions. I stared into her eyes. So compassion is considered a weakness now? Vanessa smiled again, completely cold. No, compassion is just far too expensive. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the dinner table. Michael finally cleared his throat. Vanessa, maybe we should... But she cut him off with a careless wave of her hand. I'm just being realistic, Michael. I stared at her for a few seconds, and suddenly, a harsh truth became crystal clear to me. Vanessa honestly believed this company belonged to her world now, a world of designer dresses, wealthy investors, and superficial luxury. She had absolutely no clue that the quiet older woman she was mocking at her own dinner table still held the entire world under her feet. When it came time for dessert, Vanessa didn't even bother serving the peach pie I brought. Later, when I went to use the restroom, I noticed it sitting completely untouched on the kitchen counter, right next to the trash can. For some reason, out of everything that happened that night, that was the thing that hurt the most. By the time I left the penthouse, the snow was falling heavily again. Michael walked me down to the lobby alone. For a long moment, neither of us said a word. Finally, he looked at me, his eyes filled with intense guilt, and whispered, Look, Mum, you know how Vanessa gets when she's around business people. I looked at my son, the boy I used to hold in my arms when he had a fever, the boy who used to tell me everything. This man standing in front of me now was someone I barely even recognized. Yes, I replied softly, stepping out into the freezing night. I think I finally understand exactly who she is. The prestigious law firm of Whitmore & Green was located on the 22nd floor of a historic stone building overlooking Lake Michigan. Richard used to joke that Margaret Whitmore chose the location because the building looked intimidating enough to scare off dishonest people before they even made it through the front door. On Monday morning, the moment I stepped out of the elevator, I was greeted by that familiar, comforting smell of leather-bound books, fresh coffee, and expensive polished mahogany wood. Some things never change. Margaret's young assistant smiled warmly the moment she saw me. Mrs. Perez, she's been expecting you. Go right on in. Mrs. Perez. It's always funny to me how differently people treat you the moment they know your last name. The second I walked into the private office, Margaret stood up from her desk. At 72 years old, she was still as sharp as broken glass. Her silver hair was perfectly coiffed, and her dark blue suit was pressed impeccably. But the moment her eyes met mine, her expression softened with deep concern. You look absolutely exhausted, Penelope. I let out a weak chuckle, setting my bag down. Is it really that obvious, Margaret? Yes, it is. I took a seat in the leather chair across from her desk, slowly placing my winter gloves onto my lap. For a long moment, neither of us said a word. Margaret had handled Richard's legal and corporate affairs for nearly 30 years. She knew every single version of me. The ambitious young woman who helped her husband build a hospitality empire from scratch. The grief-stricken widow who couldn't stop crying after Richard's funeral. And now, this quiet, invisible version of myself hiding inside a housekeeper's uniform. Finally, she sighed and slid a thick manila folder across the polished desk. I really wish I had called you in here for something better, Penny. My stomach tightened. I opened the folder carefully. Inside were pages of corporate layoff projections, severe healthcare cost-cutting models, and radical staff restructuring proposals. And right at the top of almost every single page was Vanessa's electronic signature of approval. As I scanned the documents, a cold, heavy anger started to spread through my chest. "They're planning to terminate 43 full-time employees?" I whispered. Margaret nodded grimly. "Most of them are over the age of 55, she added. "They're targeting housekeeping, laundry services, kitchen staff, and facilities maintenance." I flipped to another page, filled with projected annual savings, insurance reduction targets, and outsourced labour estimates. The words on the paper sounded so clean, so corporate, completely stripped of any human emotion, just numbers on a balance sheet. But I knew exactly who those numbers represented. I knew about Angela's husband, who was currently battling cancer. I knew about Mr. Delaney in maintenance, who was working double shifts to support his disabled son. I knew about Maria in the laundry room, who was raising 3 grandkids entirely on her own after her daughter passed away. Vanessa hadn't even bothered to learn a single one of their names. I slowly closed the folder. "When exactly was this proposal submitted to the board?" 3 weeks ago. "And Michael actually authorized this?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. Margaret hesitated for a second, looking pained. "It's complicated, Penny." "No," I said softly, looking her dead in the eye. "It isn't complicated at all." The silence in the office grew heavy. Finally, Margaret reached into her desk drawer, pulled out another document, and handed it to me. It was Richard's original trust agreement. Even after all these years, just seeing his bold signature at the bottom of the page gave me a sharp pang of grief. I traced my fingers over the ink. "Richard updated the family trust exactly 6 months before he passed away," Margaret said gently. "Do you remember why?" Of course I remembered. Richard already knew the cancer was spreading rapidly back then, even though he put on a brave face and pretended everything was fine whenever Michael was in the room. He spent the final months of his life meticulously preparing everything, not for himself, but for me, for the protection of the company, and for our son. "Through this trust, you still hold complete veto power, Penelope," Margaret continued. "You own 51% of the voting shares. Michael is the chief operating officer, yes, but any final major corporate decision ultimately begins and ends with you." I stared out the window at the grey, freezing Chicago skyline. "When Michael was growing up," I whispered, "Richard truly believed that he would naturally develop into a strong, principled leader on his own." Margaret folded her hands on her desk. "Richard also worried that Michael was far too desperate for validation from other people." That line hit painfully close to home. Michael had always hated letting people down. Even when he was a little boy, if 2 of his friends got into an argument at school, Michael would literally cry, trying to make both of them happy. If Richard ever raised his voice, Michael would instantly blame himself, even if he hadn't done anything wrong. He had a remarkably soft heart, and unfortunately, soft hearts tend to attract highly controlling people. Margaret studied my face. "Did you ever actually tell Michael that the family trust is still completely under your control?" "No," I admitted. "Why not, Penny?" "Because I wanted my son to love me, simply for being his mother, without millions of dollars standing between us." But I couldn't bring myself to say that out loud to her. Instead, I looked back down at Richard's signature. "His father wanted Michael to earn his own confidence," I said softly, "not just inherit it." Margaret nodded slowly, understanding completely. Then she reached for another folder. "This next part is probably going to be even harder for you to look at. Inside were internal expense reports, luxury event receipts, private travel reimbursements, and massive invoices for high-end designer consultants." I frowned, looking at the totals. What exactly am I looking at here? Vanessa's corporate spending? The numbers were staggering. A single corporate dinner party cost nearly $80,000. Another page showed massive amounts of company funds being funneled into influencer partnerships and personal public relations campaigns for Vanessa herself. "She's writing all of this off through the corporate entertainment accounts?" I asked. "Yes," Margaret replied. I looked up sharply. "Does Michael even know about this?" "Honestly, Penny, I suspect he signs whatever document she puts in front of him just to avoid an argument." That sounded exactly like my son lately. Too exhausted to fight, too desperate to avoid conflict at all costs. Margaret leaned back in her chair, sighing. "There's more." She handed me a few printed copies of internal corporate emails. One message from Vanessa read, "The aging staff is actively damaging our premium luxury aesthetic. We need younger, more vibrant faces to create a highly aspirational brand image." Another email stated, "Sentimentality is actively eating into our profit margins. We need to cut the dead weight immediately." I read every single word carefully. By the time I finished, my hands were shaking, not from shock, but from pure heartbreak. The Perez Majestic used to be known as one of the absolute best employers in the entire hospitality industry. Richard used to personally visit the hotel kitchens on holidays, shaking hands and thanking the staff who had to work on Christmas Day. 20 years ago, when a janitor's wife unexpectedly passed away, Richard secretly paid for the entire funeral out of his own pocket. He viewed the employees as an extension of our family. And now, Vanessa was looking at them like disposable pieces of furniture. Margaret's voice broke through my thoughts, gentle and cautious. "Penelope, if these layoffs actually go through, the legal backlash is going to be severe. The age discrimination claims alone could completely destroy public trust in the brand." I closed my eyes for a brief moment. For years I had kept my head down and stayed invisible because after Richard died, the grief completely changed me. Without him by my side, the public spotlight felt entirely unbearable. And to be honest, a part of me really hoped Michael would find his own footing as a leader. But now, I realized that my silence had allowed something incredibly ugly to grow in the dark. Margaret watched me quietly for a moment before speaking again. Shortly after Michael and Vanessa got married, Richard told me something. I lifted my head to look at her. He said, "Margaret, Vanessa completely confuses appearance with actual human value." A dull ache spread through my chest. Richard had seen right through her even back then. "And then he said," Margaret added softly, "if Penelope ever completely disappears from that company, there won't be anyone left to protect its soul." That sentence nearly broke me, because a terrible realization suddenly hit me. I hadn't just given up my power when I stepped away. I had completely abandoned my responsibility. This company didn't just belong to Richard and me anymore. Thousands of real, hard-working families depended on it for survival. Margaret finally asked the one question that had been hanging over us all morning. "What do you want to do, Penny?" I stared out the window at the falling snow. For a long time, I didn't say a word. Then I looked back at her. "When exactly is the annual corporate anniversary gala?" 3 weeks from tonight," Margaret answered. I nodded slowly, a calm determination settling over me. Every single year, the Perez Majestic Hotel Group hosted a massive gala to celebrate the founding of the company. Investors, executives, media outlets, and the entire board of directors always attended. Vanessa absolutely lived for that event. It was her favourite stage. Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly, a spark of recognition in them. "Penelope, I'm going to attend," I said firmly. For the first time all morning, a slight smile appeared on Margaret's face. "Good." I stood up and put my coat back on, but before I reached the door, I paused. "Margaret." "Yes, Penny." "If Richard was still here—" My voice cracked just a bit. "Do you think he'd feel like I failed our son?" Her expression softened completely. "No," she said firmly. "I think Richard would believe that you loved Michael enough to let him make his own choices, but he'd also be incredibly proud that you're finally stepping in to fix them." The elevator ride back down to the street felt incredibly heavy. It wasn't because I was afraid of the confrontation. It was because deep down, I knew that the woman who had walked into this building was completely gone. For years I had convinced myself that staying silent was an act of kindness. But my silence had ended up protecting the wrong people. Between a housekeeper's uniform and an executive's lies, my family had completely forgotten what the name Perez actually stood for. And it was finally time to remind them. The housekeeping break room always smelled like burnt coffee and industrial bleach. By 7 a.m., most of us were already exhausted. Angela was hunched over a tiny plastic table, gently rubbing her sore wrists, while Maria from the laundry room stood by the vending machine, quietly counting out the coins in her small purse. I stood near the counter, pouring cheap creamer into a cup of stale coffee, noticing how incredibly quiet everyone had become lately. Fear completely changes the atmosphere of a workplace. People don't laugh out loud anymore. They whisper in corners. They constantly look over their shoulders before they speak. Over the past week, fear had spread through this hotel faster than a winter flu. Angela finally broke the silence, her voice barely a whisper. My husband's oncology treatment got delayed again. Maria looked up immediately, her eyes wide. Why, what happened? Insurance paperwork issues, Angela said, forcing a faint smile that didn't fool anyone. The hospital claims we need a special corporate authorization first. I walked over and sat down gently right next to her. How is he feeling, Angela? He's just so tired, Penelope, she whispered, her voice trembling. Some days he can barely even find the strength to stand up. Angela had worked for the Perez Majestic for 22 years. 22 years. That was long enough to watch entire executive teams come and go. Long enough to miss countless holidays, school plays, and wedding anniversaries. And now she sat there, absolutely terrified that a single corporate decision could completely strip away her husband's medical coverage. It made me feel physically sick. Before I could even offer a word of comfort, the break room door slammed open, banging loudly against the wall. Vanessa walked in, holding a tablet and an iced coffee, with two incredibly nervous human resources managers, scurrying right behind her. The room went instantly dead silent. Vanessa looked around, her face twisted in pure impatience. Why is everyone just sitting around? She snapped. Despite the obvious pain in her knees, Angela immediately stood up straight. We're just on our scheduled morning break, Mrs. Perez, she said softly. Vanessa glanced dramatically at her expensive watch. Well, your break is officially over. Nobody argued. Nobody ever argued with her, and that was exactly what I hated the most. Fear had taught these incredibly good, kind people how to make themselves small. Vanessa's sharp eyes landed directly on me next. She frowned, looking completely annoyed by my presence. You, she said, pointing a manicured finger toward my utility cart out in the hallway. The crown moulding in the West Ballroom is covered in dust. You should have already taken care of that. Her tone carried that same cruel, condescending edge she always used whenever she addressed me in front of other people. One of the HR managers shifted uncomfortably beside her. Vanessa turned back to the rest of the room. 10 minutes, in the main conference room downstairs, mandatory staff meeting. Then she turned on her heel and walked out. The exact second the door swung shut, Angela let out a shaky breath. Maria muttered under her breath, That woman absolutely terrifies me. I stared down into my coffee cup, completely calm. No, Maria, I said quietly. Vanessa doesn't terrify me. She just deeply disappoints me. There's a big difference. 10 minutes later, nearly 40 employees were crammed into a plain, windowless conference room downstairs. The housekeeping staff stood lined up against the back wall, while the kitchen crew and maintenance workers filled the chairs. Hardly anyone spoke. Vanessa stood confidently near the projector screen, wearing a sharp, tailored white suit that made her look more like a politician than a hotel executive. Michael and our chief financial officer, Marcus Hill, was standing off to the side. My son looked completely exhausted. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his shoulders slumped heavily inside his expensive suit jacket. He didn't even look up as the staff trickled into the room. Once everyone settled down, Vanessa flashed a brilliant artificial smile. Thank you all for coming, she began smoothly. As you all know, the Perez Majestic Hotel Group is officially entering a brand new era. Corporate public relations language. It's always filled with hidden danger. She clicked a button on her remote, and a complex financial chart appeared on the screen. The luxury hospitality market is rapidly evolving, Vanessa continued, her voice echoing in the quiet room. To remain competitive, we must modernize our operations and completely maximize our efficiency. I noticed several workers exchange anxious glances. Vanessa kept right on talking. Unfortunately, that means we have to make some incredibly difficult decisions regarding our overhead. And there it was. Angela immediately lowered her head, and Maria clenched her hands tightly in her lap. Vanessa paced slowly in front of the screen, acting like a motivational speaker. Certain roles within the organization no longer align with our long-term brand vision. Release, she said, not people. That was how executives completely detached themselves from the guilt of destroying lives. Michael finally cleared his throat, speaking in a low voice. Vanessa, maybe we should... But she completely talked over him, ignoring his interruption. We need energy, adaptability, and a highly polished presentation. Then she let out a cold chuckle. To be completely frank, certain departments are currently carrying far too much dead weight. The entire room completely froze. Dead weight. I saw Angela flinch beside me, and Maria's eyes instantly filled with tears. A maintenance worker near the front muttered a quiet curse under his breath. Vanessa completely ignored it. "We will be initiating immediate staff performance evaluations," she announced coldly. "Employees who are unable to meet our newly updated standards will be transitioned out of the company." Transitioned out. What a beautiful corporate word for taking away someone's livelihood. I looked over at Michael. He was just staring blankly down at the conference table. He wasn't defending them, he wasn't stopping her, he was just letting it happen. Somehow, seeing his complete cowardice hurt infinitely more than Vanessa's blatant cruelty. A young housekeeper in the back row raised a trembling hand. "What's going to happen to our healthcare benefits, Mrs. Perez?" Vanessa's expression didn't change at all. "Those specific details are still being finalized by the legal team." The young woman swallowed hard, her voice cracking. "My mother is scheduled for a major surgery next month." Vanessa let out an impatient sigh. And that is exactly the kind of emotional thinking that completely hinders sound business decisions. Right then, something completely shifted inside me. It wasn't fiery anger. It was something much colder, much heavier, pure resolve. Angela suddenly spoke up from beside me, her voice incredibly cautious but respectful. "Many of us have given decades of our lives to this hotel, Mrs. Perez." Vanessa looked right at her, completely indifferent. "And the company has fully compensated you for your labor, Angela." Angela's face went completely pale, her spirit broken. "I couldn't stay silent for another second." "Loyalty was never supposed to be a line item on a balance sheet, Vanessa," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the tension. Every single head in the room instantly turned to look at me. Vanessa blinked slowly, looking utterly shocked that a housekeeper had dared to speak out of turn. "Excuse me," she said. I stood up straight, stepping out from the back wall. "The people in this room are the ones who actually built this company," I continued calmly. "Not some expensive marketing campaign." Vanessa let out a short, mocking laugh. "This conversation is light years above your pay grade, Penelope." A few awkward, nervous chuckles rippled through the room. My cheeks burned, but I kept my composure perfectly. Vanessa took a slow step toward me, narrowing her eyes. "You clean hotel rooms," she said, dropping her voice to a low, vicious whisper that carried perfectly across the quiet room. "You don't understand high-level corporate strategy." The ensuing silence was absolutely suffocating. Vanessa looked me up and down one more time in front of everyone, letting out a disgusted sigh. "To be completely honest, we already have more than enough old garbage cluttering up the hallways of this hotel." Angela let out a sharp gasp, and Maria looked completely horrified. Even the CFO, Marcus Hill, shifted uncomfortably in his seat.
"But Michael just sat there. He didn't say a single word, not one."
I stared at my son for several agonizing seconds, silently begging him in my heart. "Please, just this once. Stand up and say something." But he just rubbed his forehead tiredly, keeping his eyes glued to the floor. In that crushing moment, a devastating realization hit me. Michael wasn't letting her behave this way because he agreed with her. He was doing it because he was terrified of conflict, and that kind of weakness is a slow-acting poison that completely destroys a family. Vanessa turned away dismissively. Meeting adjourned. The staff began to quietly file out of the room, many of them wiping tears from their faces. Angela stayed right by my side as we walked out. "I'm so sorry, Penelope," she whispered. I forced a gentle smile. "You have absolutely nothing to apologize for, Angela." But inside, my heart felt incredibly heavy. This company used to stand for something beautiful. Richard used to know every single employee's name. He attended their funerals, their kids' graduations, their retirement dinners. He truly believed that business without a soul was just greed. And now, his own son was standing by silently, letting the workers be humiliated like disposable trash. Once the room completely emptied out, I stayed behind to pick up some abandoned papers left on the tables. That was when I noticed someone quietly approaching me from the shadows. It was Olivia Reed, a young administrative assistant from the executive floor. She looked incredibly nervous, glancing toward the door. "Mrs. Penelope," she whispered. "Yes, Olivia?" She carefully checked the hallway one more time before sliding a folded manila envelope directly into my hands. "You didn't get this from me," she whispered rapidly. I frowned slightly, looking down at the heavy envelope. "What is this?" "The internal HR layoff projections," she whispered, her heart racing. "Along with copies of the executive expense approvals for the last 2 quarters. My pulse slowed down. "Why are you giving this to me, Olivia?" Olivia looked back toward the door, her eyes filled with genuine emotion. "Because good, decent people are absolutely terrified right now, Penelope, and someone needs to put a stop to her." Before I could even answer, she turned and hurried away out of the room. I stood there alone, staring down at the envelope in my hands. It felt heavy, important, and incredibly dangerous. I slowly slipped it into my canvas workbag. Then I took one final look around the empty conference room. The polished tables, the expensive lighting, the corporate slogans framed on the walls. For the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel like a tired old housekeeper anymore. I began to remember exactly who I was. It was well past midnight by the time I finally opened Olivia's envelope. The house was completely silent, except for the rhythmic ticking of the kitchen clock and the distant lonely howl of the winter wind outside. Snow tapped softly against the window pane as I sat alone at the small dining table under the dim warm light of the old brush chandelier, the one Richard had installed nearly 30 years ago. I brewed a fresh cup of hot tea first. Richard always used to say that when you're about to face bad news, you should never do it without a warm cup of tea nearby. My hands felt completely ice cold as I pulled the documents out of the envelope. Expense reports, internal wire transfers, and luxury travel invoices billed directly to the Paris Majestic corporate accounts. I adjusted my reading glasses and began flipping through the pages. There were records for private luxury spa reservations, high-end designer wardrobe reimbursements, a $70,000 brand integration dinner in Manhattan, and an executive retreat in Napa Valley where the receipts showed far more champagne was consumed than actual business discussed. Every single line item had been explicitly authorized by Vanessa's department. I clenched my jaw, but as I kept reading, the documents got infinitely worse. There were projected salary reduction targets, a detailed list of recommended employee terminations, and precise calculations on how much corporate liability could be saved by cutting health insurance benefits for long-term workers. It was all right there, laid out in cold black and white. Vanessa wasn't just trying to impress international investors with high profit margins. She was actively stripping away the financial security of the very people who had built this company, entirely to fund her own incredibly lavish, self-indulgent lifestyle. I slowly closed the folder and leaned back in my chair, staring blankly into the darkness of the kitchen for several long minutes. I couldn't stop thinking about Angela crying over her husband's cancer treatments, about Maria counting her coins, and about the sheer suffocating fear that had filled that conference room earlier today. And underneath all of it was a painful truth that I could no longer ignore. I had allowed this to happen. Not intentionally, of course, but silence always comes with a very real cost. Suddenly, the sharp ring of my phone broke the silence, making me flinch. I picked it up immediately. "Margaret, is everything okay?" "Marcus Hill wants to meet tomorrow morning, Penny," Margaret said, getting straight to the point. Her voice sounded incredibly serious. "Private meeting. Is this about Vanessa?" "Yes," she replied. "He says it's urgent." Her tone told me everything I needed to know. The next morning, just after 8 a.m., I walked into a quiet, out-of-the-way coffee shop a few blocks from the corporate headquarters. Marcus Hill was sitting alone at a small booth near the back, wearing a dark overcoat, looking like a man who hadn't gotten a decent night's sleep in weeks. He stood up anxiously the moment he saw me. "Mrs. Perez, thank you for coming." I offered him a gentle smile, sliding into the booth. "You can still call me Penelope, Marcus." He hesitated for a second before sitting back down. Marcus had been the CFO of the Paris Majestic for over 15 years. Richard had trusted him implicitly because Marcus always valued brutal honesty over corporate politics. If a man like Marcus was this nervous, things were incredibly bad. The waitress dropped off our coffees, and the moment she walked away, Marcus slid a thin, password-protected tablet across the table. I don't know how much Margaret has already shared with you, Penelope. Enough to know that I should have stepped in a very long time ago, I replied honestly. Marcus let out a heavy, exhausted sigh. Vanessa's personal and departmental spending has completely skyrocketed over the last 18 months. It's entirely out of control. I began scrolling through the financial spreadsheets on the screen. The numbers were staggering. Inflated marketing budgets, exorbitant consulting fees paid to her personal friends, and highly questionable reimbursements pushed through executive accounts. Then I noticed a crucial detail at the bottom of the ledger. These authorizations, I said softly, they still require ultimate approval from the family trust. Marcus nodded grimly. Every single major corporate expenditure within the Paris Majestic Group technically had to be cleared through the family trust that Richard had established before his death. And I was the sole trustee with final signing authority. The system had been specifically designed that way to protect the company from reckless leadership. But looking at these files revealed one obvious fact. Vanessa had never actually bothered to learn how the company's legal structure worked. She only cared about the title and the prestige. She honestly believes Michael has complete control over everything, Marcus said carefully. And what about Michael? I asked, my heart aching. Marcus shot me a look filled with deep, exhausting pity. Your son signs whatever document she puts in front of him, Penelope. He'll do absolutely anything just to keep the peace at home. That line cut deep, mostly because I knew it was the absolute truth. Years ago, when Michael worked alongside his father, he used to challenge ideas constantly. He was thoughtful, curious, and deeply invested in the people. Now he just looked utterly beaten down, like a shadow of his former self. Marcus leaned in closer, lowering his voice. She's trying to force these massive staff layoffs through the board right before the anniversary gala. When exactly do they take effect? The morning after the gala, Marcus said. She wants to enjoy the spotlight and the praise from the investors first, before the news of the terminations goes public. I stared at him, a cold realization settling in. Of course she did. Public image was infinitely more important to Vanessa than the actual survival of the families who worked for her. Marcus rubbed his face tiredly. I tried to warn Michael privately, Penelope. I told him the optics and the ethics were completely wrong. And what did my son say? He said Vanessa was under immense pressure from the external investment groups, Marcus replied quietly.
I almost let out a cynical laugh. Investors, the convenient and visible scapegoat that every bad executive uses whenever they want to justify being completely heartless.
Richard used to say something entirely different. When it comes to money, leadership doesn't create character, Marcus. It simply exposes it. Marcus studied my expression closely. Can I ask you something completely honest, Penelope? Of course, Marcus. Why did you stay hidden for so long? He asked gently. Why let them believe you were just a housekeeper? The question hung heavily between us. I looked down into my coffee cup, watching the dark liquid swirl. Because after Richard died, I didn't recognize myself anymore. The grief completely emptied me out, and I just couldn't bring myself to face boardrooms, media interviews, or fancy corporate dinners without him by my side, because watching Michael try to build his own future felt healthier than hovering over his shoulder. And maybe, just maybe, because I desperately wanted my son to remember who he was on his own, without his mother forcing him to be a good man. But I just looked up at Marcus and said, I thought stepping back would help Michael grow into his own shoes. Marcus nodded slowly, a sad understanding in his eyes. Sometimes, Penelope, good people mistake complete absence for trust. That sentence echoed loudly in my mind long after the meeting ended. By late afternoon, I entered the hotel through the basement employee entrance and changed back into my faded blue housekeeping uniform. It's truly remarkable how completely invisible you become to the world simply based on the clothes you wear. In an executive meeting room, people hang on to your every word. In a service corridor, they don't even look you in the eye. As I pushed my heavy laundry cart down the hallway, I saw Angela vacuuming near the entrance of the West Ballroom. Her shoulders were slouched, and she looked completely defeated. You holding up okay, Angela? I asked gently, stopping beside her. She forced a weak smile, but her eyes were red and swollen from crying. Just tired, Penelope, she whispered, her voice cracking. I reached out and placed a comforting hand on her arm. What's wrong? Tell me. Angela swallowed hard, trying to keep her composure. My husband's doctor called this morning, she whispered, her tears finally spilling over. The new treatments are actually working. The tumour is shrinking. But the hospital said if we lose our corporate health insurance coverage next month, the out-of-pocket costs will be over $8,000 a cycle. We'll lose everything, Penelope. My heart broke into a million pieces right there. She looked so incredibly ashamed just saying those words out loud, as if desperately wanting her husband to live was somehow an embarrassing burden to the company. I wanted so badly to tell her the entire truth right then and there. To tell her that the layoffs weren't going to happen. To tell her that this hotel still belonged to someone who remembered that the workers were the actual heart of the business. To tell her that she was safe. But I couldn't, not yet. It wasn't the right time. Instead, I squeezed her hand tightly. You have given 22 years of honourable service to this company, Angela, I told her firmly. Never, ever forget your worth. Angela let out a sad, cynical little laugh. People like us are easily replaced, Penelope. We're just numbers. No, that was just the toxic lie Vanessa had spent years feeding everyone. Because people in power always maintain their control by convincing the workers that they are completely invisible. Suddenly, a loud burst of laughter echoed down the corridor. Vanessa. A moment later, she rounded the corner, walking side by side with Michael and two high-end event coordinators, loudly discussing the final preparations for the upcoming anniversary gala. The floral arrangements need to project ultimate luxury, Vanessa was saying sharply. I want the entire evening to completely bleed elegance. Then her eyes landed directly on me and my laundry cart. Her expression changed instantly, flooded with intense annoyance and deep embarrassment. Why is this utility cart still blocking the corridor? She snapped at me. I looked down at the cart calmly. I'm just restocking the fresh linens for the ballroom event, Mrs. Perez. Vanessa let out a dramatic, exaggerated sigh, turning to the event coordinators. Can we please ensure that the housekeeping staff stays entirely out of the executive presentation areas during gala preparation? It looks incredibly unprofessional. Michael shot a brief, fleeting glance in my direction. For a fraction of a second, that familiar wave of intense guilt washed over his face. But he quickly averted his eyes, looking down at his tablet. He remained completely silent. Vanessa kept right on talking, as if I weren't even a human being standing right in front of her. This gala is drawing major investment groups from New York and Los Angeles. Public image is absolutely everything tonight. Something inside my chest officially turned to absolute stone. It wasn't fiery anger anymore. It was pure, unadulterated clarity. Because in that exact moment, I finally understood something crucial about my daughter-in-law. Vanessa honestly believed that luxury and superficial status made her powerful. But real power is an incredibly quiet thing. Real power is the person who actually signs the checks. Real power is the ability to protect innocent people from greed. And real power never needs to scream or humiliate others, just to prove it exists. Vanessa turned back to me, waving her hand dismissively. Move the cart out of sight, Penelope, immediately. I stood my ground and looked her dead in the eye. For the first time since I had met her, I didn't lower my head, and I didn't look away. My intense, unwavering gaze seemed to make her slightly uncomfortable. It was just a tiny flicker of hesitation in her eyes, but it was enough for me to notice. Good, because 3 weeks from now, at her grand anniversary gala, while she was frantically preparing to be crowned the queen of high society, the entire world beneath her expensive designer heels was about to completely vanish. And this time, I was never going to be silent again. The night of the grand anniversary gala arrived, completely wrapped in a heavy Chicago snowstorm and brilliant silver lights. Downtown Chicago was sparkling under the pitch-black winter sky, and a continuous line of sleek black luxury limousines stretched all the way around the block outside the main entrance of the Perez Majestic Hotel. Paparazzi flashes were going off non-stop near the red carpet. High-profile investors, top executives, politicians, and wealthy socialites dressed in diamonds and custom-tailored tuxedos was smiling for the cameras as they filed through the grand doors. Inside, the light from the massive crystal chandeliers reflected perfectly off the polished marble floors, and a professional string quartet played soft classical music near the grand staircase. Everything looked absolutely flawless. Vanessa had spent months ensuring that it would be. I stood completely alone in the bedroom of my small brick house, staring intently at the dark blue garment bag hanging on the closet door. For nearly 20 minutes I couldn't bring myself to pull down the zipper, because inside that bag was the elegant emerald green silk gown that Richard had bought for me 15 years ago for our 30th wedding anniversary. It was the very last time we had ever attended a formal corporate event together before he got sick. I finally reached up and slowly pulled down the zipper. The rich fabric felt incredibly soft against my fingers, and my hands began to tremble slightly. Richard always used to tell me that green was my absolute colour because it made my eyes look so vibrant. Grief is an incredibly strange thing. Even though years pass by, certain memories remain so sharp that they can completely break your heart all over again in an instant. For a split second, a wave of intense doubt hit me, and I almost decided not to go. Maybe I could just let Margaret handle the legal board announcements without me. Maybe exposing Vanessa publicly would completely destroy the tiny shred of a relationship I had left with my son. Maybe staying hidden and silent was still the kind of thing to do. But then, the image of Angela crying over her husband's life-saving cancer treatments flashed into my mind. I remembered Maria desperately counting her coins at the vending machine, and Vanessa casually referring to those living, breathing people as dead weight. In an instant, all of my hesitation completely vanished. An hour later, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, using trembling hands to put on the elegant pearl earrings Richard had gifted me. For the first time in nearly 3 years, I didn't look like an invisible, broken-down housekeeper. I looked exactly like Penelope Perez again. The drive downtown felt completely surreal. Huge snowflakes were drifting across Michigan Avenue, and the bright holiday lights reflected off the icy pavement. Winter in Chicago is undeniably beautiful, but when you're completely alone, the cold always feels a little bit sharper. When I finally arrived at the hotel entrance, a crowd of reporters and photographers were packed tightly along the barricades. At first, none of them recognized me as I stepped out of a regular taxi, but the moment I walked up to the valet stand, the young valet's eyes went completely wide with shock. Mrs. Perez, he stammered, his face turning entirely pale. I offered him a gentle, reassuring smile. Good evening, Daniel. Word travels incredibly fast in a luxury hotel. By the time I walked through the grand lobby doors, a wave of intense whispers had already begun spreading like wildfire among the staff. Look, that's her. Oh my God, is that really Penelope Perez? The entire energy in the room shifted instantly. Several housekeepers stood up perfectly straight, staring at me in absolute disbelief. And deep down in my heart, a profound sense of sadness washed over me. I was the exact same human being they saw every single day, but simply because I was wearing an expensive dress instead of a stained blue uniform, the world suddenly treated me with immense respect. That realization alone told me everything that was deeply wrong with society. The entrance to the grand ballroom was glowing with golden lights and massive, towering arrangements of white orchids. Vanessa was standing right at the front, greeting billionaire investors with practiced high society elegance, while photographers snapped photos of her every move. She looked completely radiant, confident, and utterly untouchable, until her sharp eyes locked onto me. The expression that washed over her face was a spectacular sequence of pure confusion, utter disbelief, and immediate panic. Her perfect manicured smile instantly froze. I walked slowly across the polished marble floor toward her, my heels clicking softly against the stone, cutting right through the ambient classical music. Around us, the loud conversations of the wealthy guests began to quietly die down. Vanessa quickly recovered her composure, forcing a tight, artificial smile as she stepped in front of me, completely blockading the path. "Penelope?" she whispered through gritted teeth, her voice dripping with venom. "What on earth are you doing here? I know for a fact that I didn't extend an invitation to you." Michael appeared at her side a second later, holding a glass of champagne. The exact moment his eyes landed on me, every single drop of colour completely drained from his face.
His voice was barely a squeak.
I saw the realization hit him instantly. He recognized the emerald gown. He recognized the pearls, and he recognized the unyielding confidence in my posture. For the first time in years, my son was looking at the woman I used to be. Vanessa stepped even closer, lowering her voice to a harsh, threatening whisper. I am warning you, Penelope. Turn around and leave right now. You are not ruining this night for us. It was almost comical. She honestly believed that she still had the authority to give me orders. A corporate photographer suddenly stepped forward, completely interrupting her. Mrs. Carter Perez, can we please get a quick photo of you and your guest near the main stage? Vanessa's posture instantly went rigid, her perfect public persona snapping right back into place. Of course, she said smoothly, flashing a brilliant smile for the camera. Then she turned her head slightly toward me, keeping her smile plastered on, while whispering viciously, Go sit in the very back row, Penelope. The international investors will be incredibly confused if they see a housekeeper mingling in the VIP section. There it was again. Even now, seeing me dressed in fine silk and expensive pearls, her immediate instinct was to try and make me feel entirely inferior. Michael looked completely appalled by her words. Vanessa, stop it, he muttered weakly, but she completely ignored him. I just let out a calm, quiet laugh. No, Vanessa, I replied softly, looking her dead in the eye. I think tonight the people in this room deserve to see the absolute truth. The pure calm in my voice clearly terrified her for a split second. I saw the subtle flash of panic in her eyes, and it felt incredibly empowering. Within minutes, the grand ballroom was packed to absolute capacity. Hundreds of wealthy guests gathered under the sparkling crystal chandeliers, and waiters carrying silver trays of expensive champagne moved gracefully through the crowd. I could feel the eyes of the hotel staff tracking my every move from the edges of the room. When Angela saw me standing near the main VIP lounge, she accidentally dropped the linen napkin she was holding. Her eyes were so incredibly wide with shock that I had to fight the urge to smile. Penelope, she whispered frantically as I walked over to her. I reached out and gently touched her arm. Please don't be alarmed, Angela. You're Mrs. Perez? She stammered, looking like she was about to faint right onto the floor. I nodded gently. I'm still the exact same person I was yesterday, Angela. Nothing has changed. Her eyes instantly filled with tears of relief, and right then, a profound, aching realization hit me. The hard-working staff of this hotel were infinitely more happy to see the real me than my own son was. Across the ballroom, a series of bright stage lights began to flash, signaling that the opening presentations were about to begin. Vanessa walked up the steps to the main stage, looking absolutely flawless, but I could see the underlying fear radiating off her. She knew something was deeply wrong, she just didn't know how catastrophic it was about to get. Marcus Hill quietly approached me from behind, holding a glass of water. The board of directors is completely assembled in the front row, Penelope, he whispered. And Robert Sinclair arrived about 10 minutes ago. He's waiting for your signal. I nodded slowly. Robert Sinclair had been on the executive board of the Paris Majestic since the very first day Richard incorporated the business. Unlike Vanessa, Robert knew exactly who built the foundation of this company. And tonight, he was going to make sure the entire world remembered it too. Michael suddenly pushed his way through the crowd, heading straight toward me. He looked completely panicked, sweating through his expensive suit. Mom, please, he whispered frantically. What's going on? What are you doing? I looked closely at my son, the boy I had spent my entire life trying to protect. Even now, seeing him look so terrified made a part of my heart ache. That is the ultimate tragedy of being a mother. No matter how deeply your children hurt you, a piece of your soul always wants to shield them from the storm. You're about to find out exactly what's going on, Michael, I said softly and calmly. Michael looked genuinely terrified now. Please, Mom, whatever you're planning, don't do this to us in public. Think about the embarrassment. That one sentence told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't saying, Mom, please tell me I didn't ruin this family. He wasn't saying, I'm so sorry for how we treated you. No, his only concern was about the public embarrassment. He was completely consumed by the superficial image, just like Vanessa. I looked at him with a profound sense of sadness. Your father used to say that the truth only becomes a dangerous thing when people spend far too long trying to run away from it, Michael. Before he could even respond, the ballroom speakers erupted with a loud fanfare of music. The anniversary presentation had officially begun. Vanessa walked out to the center of the stage, under a massive spotlight, flashing a brilliant smile as the entire room erupted into thunderous applause. She looked every bit like the undisputed queen of the Paris Majestic Empire, and that was truly the saddest part of all, because she honestly believed that the throne belonged to her. The house lights faded to black, and all eyes turned to the stage. Vanessa gracefully lifted the microphone to her lips, but underneath all the luxury, the champagne, and the glittering diamonds, the very foundation of her perfect world had already completely crumbled. Vanessa stood directly underneath a cascading waterfall of bright stage lights, smiling radiantly as if the entire night were a personal tribute to her brilliance. In her mind, her ultimate victory was already a guaranteed fact. The massive ballroom was completely glowing around her, filled with hundreds of wealthy high society guests sitting at candlelit tables. The billionaire investment groups from New York occupied the entire front row, sitting right alongside local politicians and top-tier luxury hospitality executives.
And Vanessa was absolutely soaking in every single second of the attention.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our annual celebration, she began, her polished, eloquent voice echoing perfectly through the high-end audio system. The Paris Majestic Hotel Group has never been just about providing a place to stay. We represent the absolute pinnacle of luxury, innovation, and bold, forward-thinking leadership. A wave of polite corporate applause rippled through the ballroom. I stood completely still in the very back row, right next to Angela, who still looked like she might pass out at any moment. Across the room, Michael stood frozen near the edge of the stage stairs. His face had gone entirely pale. He knew a storm was coming, he just had no idea how destructive it was about to be. Vanessa continued her speech with complete, unshakable confidence. To thrive in today's rapidly evolving global market, a luxury brand must be entirely willing to modernize its operations. We can no longer afford to survive on outdated operational systems or purely emotional corporate decisions.
Several prominent investors in the front row nodded their heads in deep agreement. Off to the side, I saw our CFO, Marcus Hill, briefly close his eyes in pure disgust.
Vanessa's smile grew even wider. The ultimate survival and growth of our brand depends entirely on a leadership team that is completely unafraid to embrace radical change. There was that word again. Change. When used with genuine integrity, it's a beautiful concept. But when used to mask heartless greed and the destruction of human lives, it's an incredibly dangerous weapon. She spent the next 10 minutes loudly boasting about massive projected profit margins, aggressive global brand expansion, and premium market repositioning. Every single sentence was meticulously rehearsed to project ultimate corporate perfection. But the more she spoke, the more a profound sense of sorrow washed over me. Richard had spent his entire life building this empire around the value of real human beings, and Vanessa was completely dismantling it to build a shrine to superficial appearances. Finally, she gracefully raised her crystal champagne glass toward the audience. Please join me in raising a glass to the brilliant, unchecked future of the Paris Majestic. The entire ballroom erupted into loud, enthusiastic applause. Then, looking down at the front row tables with an incredibly smug expression, Vanessa casually added, and of course, absolutely none of this unprecedented success would be possible without the visionary executive leadership team that my husband and I have carefully built together from the ground up. My husband and I. I watched Michael flinch slightly under the bright lights. Even now, at the absolute height of her speech, her ego wouldn't allow her to put anyone else first. The moment Vanessa began lowering the microphone to step away from the podium, a booming, authoritative voice suddenly echoed from the front of the room, completely cutting through the applause. Actually, Vanessa, before we move on with the evening's festivities, there is one critical acknowledgement that this board absolutely must make first. The entire ballroom went completely dead silent. Vanessa blinked in total shock, her artificial smile freezing in place. Robert Sinclair slowly stood up from his prime seat in the front row, calmly adjusting his tuxedo jacket as he walked toward the stage steps. At 74 years old, Robert carried a natural, effortless command. The kind of immense presence possessed by men who never need to raise their voice just to control a room. Vanessa forced another tight smile, her eyes darting nervously. "Of course, Robert. The floor is yours." Robert walked up to the podium and smoothly took the microphone from her trembling hand. "I have proudly served on the board of directors for the Perez Majestic Group for nearly 40 years, he began, his voice carrying perfectly across the quiet ballroom. "And during that time, I have had the distinct privilege of witnessing truly extraordinary leadership." He paused, his sharp gaze slowly sweeping across the entire room. "I personally watched Richard Perez and his brilliant wife build this entire hospitality empire with their bare hands, transforming a crumbling 12-room roadside motel into one of the most respected luxury brands in the United States." An intense wave of whispers instantly broke out among the hundreds of guests. Vanessa's perfect smile completely vanished, her jaw tightening. Robert continued, his voice completely steady. "While many of the newer faces in this room tonight honestly believe they know exactly who is running this organization," he paused for dramatic effect, "very few people actually know who truly owns it." An absolute suffocating silence fell over the entire ballroom. I watched Vanessa's posture go completely rigid. Michael looked as if he had been physically turned to ice. Robert turned his head slightly, looking directly toward the very back row of the room. "Sure, tonight," Robert announced, his voice booming with immense pride, "it is my absolute honor to officially introduce the majority shareholder and true owner of the Perez Majestic Hotel Group." My heart rate slowed down to a perfectly calm rhythm. When the truth finally steps into the light after being hidden for so long, it brings a profound sense of peace. Robert smiled warmly into the crowd. "Mrs. Penelope Perez?" The ballroom instantly erupted into a chaotic storm of utterly confused murmurs. Hundreds of wealthy guests spun around in their seats, frantically scanning the room to see who he was talking about. Vanessa let out a sharp, nervous, completely frantic laugh. "What?" she whispered under her breath, her eyes darting around the stage. I slowly stepped out from the back wall and began walking down the center aisle of the ballroom. The crowd of wealthy socialites and international investors completely parted before me, staring in absolute awe. The hotel staff along the walls looked completely dumbfounded. A wealthy woman in the front row let out a sharp, audible gasp. "Oh my goodness, look at her!" The sharp, rhythmic click of my high heels against the polished marble floor echoed clearly through the quiet room as I approached the stage. Every single drop of color had completely drained from Vanessa's face.
"No," she whispered frantically, her voice trembling with terror as she watched me approach. "No, that's completely impossible."
Michael looked as if he had completely forgotten how to breathe. I walked up the carpeted stage steps, and the entire room erupted into a frenzy of flashing cameras as paparazzi from every major outlet began snapping photos wildly. The moment I reached the top of the stage, Robert Sinclair respectfully stepped forward and offered me his arm, bowing his head slightly. That simple gesture almost broke my heart, because an absolute stranger was showing me more public respect than my own family had given me in years. Robert gently handed me the microphone. The entire ballroom was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Vanessa was staring at me, her chest heaving, her wide eyes filled with an intense mix of pure panic and complete confusion. "This isn't funny, Michael," she hissed fiercely under her breath, turning to my son. "Tell me this is some kind of sick joke." But Michael couldn't answer her, because deep down in his soul, my son already knew the absolute truth. He just never imagined it would face him like this. Robert turned and pointed a hand toward the massive digital presentation screen behind us on the stage. Within seconds, the official, legally binding corporate trust documents were projected in giant letters for the entire audience to see.
Perez Family Trust, majority shareholder, Penelope Perez, sole legal and financial signing authority, Penelope Perez.
A massive, collective gasp echoed through the entire room. Vanessa instinctively took a panicked step backward, shaking her head. "No," she stammered, her voice cracking. "There has to be some kind of administrative error. This is a mistake." Marcus Hill slowly stood up from his front row seat, looking directly at her with complete authority. "There is absolutely no mistake, Vanessa," he said firmly. Every eye in the room locked onto him. "As the chief financial officer of this corporation," Marcus continued, his voice echoing with absolute certainty, "I can officially confirm that every single major financial authorization within the Perez Majestic Group must be fully cleared through the Perez Family Trust." He paused, letting the words sink in. "And Mrs. Penelope Perez has always maintained sole, absolute control over that trust." The look of sheer, unadulterated shock that washed over Vanessa's face was so intense it looked physically painful. And then Marcus delivered the final, crushing blow. "And that includes every single executive compensation check that has been issued by this company over the last 3 years." The ballroom erupted into absolute chaos. Guests were whispering furiously, and Vanessa's breathing became completely ragged. Slowly, almost mechanically, she turned her head and looked right at me. In that exact second, the crushing reality of her situation finally hit her. Every single massive paycheck she had bragged about, every luxury bonus she had spent, every designer clothing reimbursement she had submitted, and the entire lavish lifestyle she used to look down on me had been personally funded and approved by the exact woman she had called garbage. My son looked completely devastated. It wasn't anger on his face. It was pure, crushing realization. For the very first time, Michael was seeing the full destructive weight of his own cowardice. Vanessa was shaking her head violently, tears of pure humiliation welling up in her eyes. You are working as a housekeeper," she whispered, her voice trembling with desperation. "Why? Why would you ever do something like that?" I looked at her with complete calmness, my voice steady. "I did it because I wanted to see exactly how you treated the people who actually build this company when you thought nobody was watching, Vanessa." That answer cut deeper than any angry scream ever could. Vanessa's mouth hung slightly open, completely speechless. Around the room, the hotel staff were standing frozen in absolute awe. I looked toward the back entrance and saw Angela openly crying, while Maria covered her mouth with trembling hands. They finally understood why an old housekeeper had cared enough to listen to their struggles when the rest of the executive team treated them like they were completely invisible. Because this hotel had never stopped belonging to me. Vanessa suddenly spun around to face Michael, her voice filled with pure betrayal. "Did you know about this? Did you keep this from me?" Michael's face twisted with immense guilt. "No, Vanessa. I swear I didn't know." That answer completely broke whatever spirit she had left. Because if Michael didn't know, it meant her entire empire of arrogance had been built on a complete assumption. A fatal assumption. She turned back to me, her voice dropping to a desperate whisper. "You stood there and let me humiliate myself in front of everyone. You set me up." I looked at her with a quiet, unwavering gaze. "No, Vanessa," I said softly. "You built that humiliation all by yourself. I just chose to stop hiding the foundation." The silence that followed felt like an eternity under the bright stage lights. Then Robert Sinclair stepped up beside me once again. "Nui, the board of directors will be issuing a formal statement regarding corporate restructuring and executive leadership changes first thing tomorrow morning," he announced calmly to the crowd. "But tonight, we believe it is only fitting that we pay tribute to the true heart of this company. Long before any of us sat in these boardrooms, it was this woman's integrity that protected the soul of the Perez Majestic." A single slow clap started from a corner in the very back of the room. Then another worker joined in, and then another, until the entire housekeeping and kitchen staff were clapping loudly. Within seconds, the infection of respect spread to the front rows, and the entire ballroom erupted into a thunderous standing ovation. It wasn't an applause for corporate branding, luxury aesthetics, or profit margins. It was a standing ovation for pure human dignity. I looked out into the crowd through the tears blurring my vision. Standing underneath those brilliant crystal chandeliers, watching the hospitality empire Richard and I built finally reclaim its soul, I realized something completely unexpected. I didn't feel powerful. For the first time in 3 years, I just felt completely free. The thunderous applause continued echoing through the grand ballroom for so long that it completely pushed Vanessa past her breaking point. I could see it clearly in the way her posture entirely collapsed. Every single clap from the audience felt like another sharp crack in the perfect high society image she had spent years desperately trying to maintain. She stood completely frozen in the center of the stage, her breathing shallow and panicked, as the non-stop flashes of the corporate cameras reflected off her face. The wealthy investors in the front row were whispering behind their champagne glasses, and the hotel staff were now staring at her openly, making absolutely no effort to hide their shock. In all the years I had known her, this was the first time Vanessa looked genuinely small. It wasn't because she had lost her corporate title. It was because the absolute truth had stripped away her entire performance. Michael still hadn't moved an inch. He stood at the bottom of the stage steps, staring up at me with an expression of pure bewilderment, as if he no longer recognized the woman standing at the podium. And maybe he didn't. Maybe over the last few years, I had allowed myself to become so invisible that even my own son had forgotten the strength of the woman who raised him. Robert Sinclair quietly leaned in toward me, lowering the microphone slightly. "Would you like to say a few words to the guests, Penelope?" I looked out across the massive, glittering ballroom. I saw Angela standing near the back entrance, wiping tears from her eyes. I saw Maria holding tightly to the hand of another young housekeeper. I saw the waiters standing perfectly still with their silver trays, and I saw Vanessa, whose entire world had just completely vanished. In that exact moment, a profound realization washed over me. This night wasn't about revenge at all. It was about accountability. I slowly stepped up to the microphone, and the entire ballroom instantly went dead silent. "When my late husband Richard and I built the very first Paris Majestic," I began, my voice carrying softly but clearly through the room, "we only had 12 rooms, a gravel parking lot, and a roof that leaked every single time it rained." A few quiet warm chuckles rippled through the front row tables. I offered them a small smile. Our very first guests used to complain constantly because our hot water heater would completely break down every other night. Richard would spend all night in the freezing mud fixing the pipes, while I, pregnant with Michael, would go room to room personally cleaning the linens and scrubbing the floors. My son immediately lowered his head, unable to look at me. "We were incredibly poor back then," I continued, my voice growing stronger. "But Richard and I made a sacred promise to each other. We promised that no matter how big this company grew, we would never, ever forget the people who do the hardest, most exhausting work in these buildings." An absolute heavy silence fell over the entire room. I slowly turned my head, looking past the wealthy investors, straight toward the hotel staff lining the back walls. The housekeepers, the cooks, the maintenance crew, the laundry workers, and the runners. My throat tightened with genuine emotion. The beautiful, hard-working people, whose names our wealthy guests rarely ever bother to learn. In the back of the room, several housekeepers openly began wiping tears from their faces, holding their heads high. Then I looked straight at Vanessa. Yet over the last few years, I've heard the workers of this company referred to as burdens. Vanessa swallowed hard. I continued quietly. "Liabilities." An uncomfortable shift rippled through the room. "Old trash." This time, the silence was agonizing. Vanessa's face flushed bright red as the realization hit everyone in the room. Those insults weren't rumors anymore. They were her own words. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The quiet truth always travels further than a scream. "I spent 3 years working in our hotels wearing a housekeeping uniform," I said, looking carefully around the ballroom. Not because I was ashamed of my name, but because I wanted to see if this company still had a soul. Across the room, Angela broke down, openly crying into her hands. I gently gestured toward the staff gathered against the wall. These people stood by this company through holidays, blizzards, pandemics, and their own personal tragedies. I turned my eyes back to Vanessa, and some of them received nothing but disrespect in return. Vanessa finally snapped, stepping forward. "That's not fair," she hissed, her sudden outburst startling the room. She looked around desperately. "You're painting me as some kind of cruel villain." I held her gaze, steady and unyielding. "You called living, breathing human beings liabilities." Vanessa's breath hitched. I was speaking from a standpoint of business efficiency. "No," I replied softly. "You were talking about people." A low murmur broke out among the guests. Vanessa immediately turned to Michael. "Say something." My son looked completely broken. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. Because what was left to defend? The truth was right there in front of everyone. Vanessa looked back at me, her desperation turning into panic. "You hid in housekeeping for years. I worked alongside people you completely ignored. That is manipulation." The accusation echoed through the hall. For the first time all evening, I felt a spark of anger. Not because she was attacking me, but because even now, after everything, she couldn't admit her mistakes. She still saw herself as the victim. I took a quiet step closer. "No, Vanessa," I said softly. "Pretending to care while quietly using corporate funds to finance your lavish dinners and personal branding, that is manipulation." The colour drained from her face completely. Michael's head snapped up. "What?" The ballroom erupted into whispers once more. Vanessa turned to him sharply. "Michael, don't listen to her right now." But Marcus Hill was already walking toward the stage, holding a thin manila folder. He handed it directly to Robert. Robert opened it calmly, then looked out at the room. An internal review is currently underway regarding executive spending. Vanessa's voice went an octave higher. "You audited me?" The panic in her tone told everyone everything they needed to know. Michael stared at her, utterly stunned. "Vanessa, what is he talking about?" She grabbed his arm tightly. "This is exactly why your mother did this in public. She wanted to humiliate me."
Ah, humiliation. What an interesting word. I thought about standing in the laundry room while she mocked my shoes. I thought about her forcing me to use the freight elevator because of a guest complaint. I thought about her calling me trash in front of the staff. But somehow, in her mind, her humiliation was the only kind that mattered.
Michael slowly pulled his arm away. "You misused company funds?" Vanessa scoffed, her eyes flashing with anger. "Oh, please. Everyone uses company accounts." Marcus spoke up firmly from the side of the stage. "Not everyone charges luxury jewelry to the hotel hospitality account." The ballroom nearly boiled over with whispers. Vanessa looked cornered now, dangerously cornered. And people who feel cornered always show exactly who they are. Suddenly she pointed a finger straight at me. "This is all because she never accepted me." The room went dead silent again. Vanessa's voice cracked with raw emotion. "She looked down on me from the very beginning because I wasn't wealthy enough for this family." The statement caught me off guard, not because it was true, but because she actually believed it. I looked at her with a profound sadness. "Vanessa, no. You've always judged me," she shouted. A sudden ache flared in my chest, because beneath all the arrogance and the cruelty, I briefly saw that poor, terrified girl again. The girl who used to hide her second-hand shoes in her school locker, terrified of feeling worthless. But pain is never an excuse for cruelty. Still, I spoke gently. "I never cared where you came from." Vanessa let out a bitter, tearful laugh. "That's always easy for billionaires to say." A heavy silence settled over the room. I watched her for a few long seconds. Then I answered quietly. "Richard and I once shared a single hamburger for dinner because we couldn't afford two."
Vanessa froze.
So no," I continued softly. "I have never judged poverty." My voice hardened just a fraction. "What I judge is how you treated others once you escaped it." Those words hit harder than anything else I had said all night. Because deep down, Vanessa knew it was true. The silence that followed felt endless. Then unexpectedly, Angela stepped forward from the back of the room. Her hands were shaking slightly. "Mrs. Perez." I looked at her warmly. Angela swallowed hard and raised her voice. "Last year, when my husband's medical treatments weren't covered by insurance, someone paid the remaining balance anonymously. Vanessa looked confused. Tears welled in Angela's eyes. It was you. More staff members began whispering emotionally around the room. Maria spoke up next. She helped pay for my grandson's surgery. Another voice. She paid for my daughter's textbooks. And another, and she never told a soul. I closed my eyes briefly. I had never wanted recognition for any of it. Richard and I simply believed that if you have the power to help, you do it. That's all. But standing under these chandeliers, watching the staff step forward one by one to defend me, I realized something vital. True leadership isn't built on fear. It's built on the lives you quietly protect when nobody is watching. The gala never quite recovered after that. Even when the music resumed and the servers awkwardly continued pouring champagne, the atmosphere had permanently shifted. People spoke in hushed tones, hands covering their mouths. Investors checked their phones anxiously. The staff looked at Vanessa differently now, not with fear, but with total clarity. And when a person's power relies entirely on perception, clarity is a dangerous thing. I left the gala before midnight, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I was exhausted. It was a specific kind of weariness that comes from carrying the truth in silence for years, only to finally lay it down in public. By the time I walked out to my car, the snow had laid a soft white blanket over the windshield. Chicago past midnight looked quieter, almost gentle. I drove through the empty streets alone, memories replaying in my mind. Michael running down the hotel hallways in his socks as a little boy. Richard teaching him how to shake a worker's hand properly. Vanessa crying in my kitchen years ago, admitting how ashamed she was of the poverty she grew up in. So much pain. So many opportunities to be better. Somewhere along the way, we had all failed each other in different ways. I had just taken off my earrings at home when there was a knock at the front door. 3 quiet taps. I already knew who it was. Michael stood on the porch, looking completely drained. Snowflakes clung to his dark coat, and the cold wind howled around him. For a moment he just looked at me, unable to speak. He looked older tonight. Not physically, but in his spirit. I silently stepped aside. Come in. He walked in slowly, looking around the small house, as if really seeing it for the first time in years. The old sofa, the faded curtains, the framed photos on the wall. Pieces of a life he had spent so much energy trying to distance himself from. I instinctively moved toward the kitchen. And do you still take your tea with too much sugar? A faint, painful smile crossed his face. Yeah. Neither of us spoke while the kettle heated. The silence between a mother and her son is different from any other. It carries history. Finally, I placed a steaming mug in front of him at the kitchen table and sat down across from him. Michael wrapped his hands around the mug, but didn't drink. Finally, he whispered, "Why didn't you tell me?" There it was, not anger, not rage, but hurt. I looked down at my own cup before answering. "Because I wanted you to grow into a man who takes responsibility." Michael let out a bitter chuckle. "Well, look how that turned out." His voice cracked slightly on the last word. My chest tightened with pain. "You've always been capable, Michael." "No," he said, shaking his head slowly. "Dad was capable. You were capable." I frowned slightly. "You built this company with him. You could have been too." Michael stared at the table for a few seconds. Then he finally voiced the truth I think he had been avoiding for years. "I knew Vanessa could be difficult." Difficult. What an understatement for cruelty. "But I didn't realize." His voice trembled. "I didn't know it had gotten that bad. I studied my son quietly." "No, you did know." The words landed heavily. Michael looked up sharply. "You saw her humiliate the staff." Silence. "You saw her insult me." More silence. "You watched her treat kindness as a weakness." Tears immediately flooded his eyes. Suddenly, he wasn't an executive or a husband anymore. He was just my little boy, carrying a weight of guilt that was too heavy for him. "I kept thinking things would settle down," he whispered. I closed my eyes briefly. That was Michael's greatest flaw. He thought avoiding conflict prevented harm, but sometimes avoiding conflict is the harm.
"She controlled everything," he admitted softly. "Every conversation turned into a battlefield."
My heart ached hearing that, not because it excused him, but because I recognized the exhaustion in his voice. Vanessa hadn't just been dominant in the boardroom. She had monopolized all the emotional space. Michael rubbed his face with his hands, looking exhausted. "After Dad died," he swallowed hard, "everything changed. I waited silently. You disappeared. That hit me harder than I expected." Michael looked slowly around the kitchen. You stopped coming to meetings, stopped calling investors, stopped showing up. I was grieving. So was I. The honesty in that statement almost broke me, because he was right. Richard's death had shattered us both in different ways. I retreated into silence. Michael buried himself in work and a marriage. Neither path had healed anything. For a long time, neither of us said a word. Then Michael asked softly, Were you really just working as a janitor all these years to watch us? I offered a faint smile. Not at first. What changed? I looked out the window at the falling snow, lost in thought. At first, I just wanted a simple life. After your father passed, the boardroom felt unbearable. Michael nodded slightly. But then I started seeing things. Like what? Fear. The word hung heavy between us. The employees' fear of management, the manager's obsession with appearances, people forgetting how to treat one another. Michael's face contorted slightly. And me. I didn't answer right away, because mothers spend their whole lives trying to protect their children from pain. Even the pain they deserve. Finally, I whispered, Yes. Michael lowered his head. I became weak. No, I said gently. You became afraid. That broke him, and the quiet tears turned into full, heavy sobbing. I hadn't seen my son cry since Richard's funeral. Watching him sit there in his expensive suit, completely lost, tore something open inside me all over again. I failed you, he choked out. No, I said, my voice surprising even myself with its tenderness. You failed yourself. He covered his face with his trembling hands. I loved her. I know. And now I don't even recognize our life. I slowly reached across the table and touched his hand. For a few seconds, he just clung to my fingers, the way he used to during thunderstorms when he was small. I should have stood up for you, he whispered. I nodded once. Yes, you should have. Sometimes the truth matters far more than comfort. Michael took a deep breath. She said you embarrassed us. The words sat painfully between us. I looked around my tiny kitchen. It was my existence that embarrassed her, I corrected softly. He wept harder at that. Finally, he asked the question I think he feared the most. What happens now?
I thought about Vanessa standing under those crystal chandeliers tonight, watching her perfect world crumble in public. I thought about the audits, the investors, the board, the staff, and beneath it all, family. Broken family.
I don't know yet, I admitted honestly. Michael looked down at his mug. Then he whispered, She's furious. I imagine she is. She thinks you orchestrated this whole thing just to destroy her. I let out a sad chuckle. No, sweetheart. I looked him right in the eye. Vanessa destroyed herself the moment she stopped seeing people as human beings. The kitchen went silent again. Then Michael finally whispered the words I think he'd been wanting to say all night. I'm sorry, Mom. Simple words, late words, but honest ones. And that meant something. I squeezed his hand gently as the snow continued to fall outside the small house. For the first time in years, my son was actually looking at me. Not at Vanessa, not at the investors, not at an image, but at me. And despite the pain of the evening, that alone felt like a beginning. The audit into executive spending began officially on Monday morning. By Tuesday afternoon, the entire executive floor felt like a building waiting for an earthquake. Nobody was smiling anymore. Assistants whispered behind half-closed office doors. Department heads suddenly avoided eye contact in the hallways. Security personnel lingered near the conference rooms, pretending not to listen, while the legal team hurried between offices carrying stacks of folders. The fear had changed sides, and Vanessa absolutely hated the feeling. I arrived at the hotel just after 8 in the morning, wearing a beige wool coat instead of a housekeeping uniform for the first time in years. The reaction from the staff was immediate. People stood a little taller when they saw me. Some smiled nervously. Others looked thrilled. Angela nearly dropped her clipboard. You look beautiful, she whispered as I approached her near the front desk. I touched her arm gently. How is your husband doing? He starts his treatments again next week. Her eyes immediately filled with tears. Because of the insurance? I nodded slowly. The restructuring plans that would have laid off so many workers had been frozen on Friday night, right after the gala. It was one of the first actions I took. It hadn't been officially announced yet, but the staff was already hearing whispers. Good whispers, for a change. As I stepped into the executive elevator, I caught my reflection briefly in the mirrored walls. For years I had deliberately hidden myself. Now I felt the building shifting around me. Not because I had changed, but because the truth had changed what people were allowed to see. When I reached the top floor, the boardroom doors were wide open. Inside, the tension was almost thick enough to breathe. Marcus sat at the far end, reviewing the audit summary alongside 2 external legal counsels. Robert Sinclair stood quietly by the window while a few board members whispered among themselves. And Vanessa? Vanessa looked incandescent with rage. Not fear. Rage. She sat rigidly at the conference table, dressed in black from head to toe, looking like someone attending a funeral. Perhaps she was. Michael stood by the coffee machine, looking entirely worn out. When he saw me walk in, his expression softened slightly. Vanessa noticed immediately, and her jaw tightened. Robert cleared his throat gently. "Shall we begin?" Nobody answered. The lead auditor calmly opened a thick report. Over the past 18 months, he began, multiple executive expenses were improperly classified under hotel branding and corporate development accounts. Vanessa crossed her arms. "This is ridiculous." The auditor ignored her and continued. Several of these expenditures were clearly personal in nature. The projection screen behind him lit up. Records of luxury jewelry purchases, private spa invoices, designer consultant contracts, and international travel unrelated to business operations. Each line showed the transaction dates and authorization paths. The room was dead silent, except for the click of the report slides changing. Michael stared at the screen like a man watching his life unravel in public. Vanessa finally snapped. "Every executive in hospitality spends money on image management." Marcus spoke calmly from across the table. "Not through hidden reimbursement structures, they don't." Vanessa turned on him sharply. "Oh, please, Marcus, don't play the moral authority now." He didn't react. That seemed to infuriate her even more. The auditor switched to another slide. This one showed internal emails. Vanessa's face lost its colour instantly. She recognized them immediately. One email read, "Older staff members are damaging the luxury perception metrics." Another, "Housekeeping personnel should remain out of sight during investor events." A deadly silence filled the room. I watched a few board members exchange uncomfortable glances. One older investor muttered a quiet, "Jesus Christ." Vanessa stood up abruptly. "You are taking those completely out of context."
"No," Robert said quietly. "I don't think we are."
Her breathing became ragged. For the first time since I had known her, Vanessa looked truly cornered, and beneath the anger I finally saw something else. Fear. Pure fear. Because people who build their identity around status tend to panic when they lose control over how they are perceived. Vanessa's entire world relied on projecting a posture of strength, and now she was completely exposed. Michael finally spoke, his voice raspy. "Why didn't you tell me about these expenses?" Vanessa stared at him in disbelief. "You're questioning me right now?" Yes. That single word shifted the atmosphere in the room, because for the first time in years, Michael sounded resolute. Vanessa noticed it too. "You signed off on those approvals yourself," she snapped. "Because I trusted you." "Oh, spare me." She let out a bitter laugh. "Don't act innocent all of a sudden." Pain flashed across Michael's face. Unfortunately, she wasn't entirely wrong. When silence goes on long enough, it becomes complicity. Vanessa looked around the room wildly. "You all loved me 6 months ago," she said sharply. "Now suddenly everyone is shocked?" Nobody answered. Because once again, she wasn't completely wrong. The powerful often tolerate cruelty until the consequences are made public. The lead auditor cleared his throat carefully. "We also have concerns regarding potentially discriminatory staffing practices."
Vanessa rolled her eyes dramatically. "Because I wanted efficiency."
"Because multiple employees over the age of 55 were specifically targeted for termination." She let out a harsh laugh. "This is a business, not a daycare." That comment ended it. I watched it happen in real time. The final collapse. Even the last few sympathetic faces around the table hardened after that. Because when arrogance reaches a certain level, it becomes indefensible. Michael closed his eyes briefly. Then he asked the most important question in a quiet whisper. "Did you ever care about the employees?" Vanessa looked stunned. "What? The people who work for us?" His voice cracked slightly. "Did they ever mean anything to you at all?" For a fraction of a second, something like real emotion flashed across her face. Then the anger returned. I cared about protecting this company. No, I said softly from across the room. You cared about controlling how it looked. Vanessa turned to me instantly. And you, she hissed, hiding in a housekeeping uniform, judging everyone. I met her gaze calmly. I was listening. You humiliated me in public. My chest tightened slightly. You humiliated yourself long before that gala, Vanessa. The room returned to silence. Vanessa's eyes suddenly filled with tears. Not soft tears, but angry ones. I spent my entire life working so I wouldn't be poor anymore. The confession hung heavy in the boardroom. For one painful second, I saw that younger version of her again. The scared girl from Texas. The girl who was embarrassed by her second-hand shoes. The girl who desperately never wanted to feel powerless again. But somewhere along the way, Vanessa had confused dignity with superiority, and that confusion had ruined everything. Michael looked at her sadly. You became cruel. She let out a tearful, bitter laugh. And you became weak? The words hit him visibly. Vanessa stood there, shaking, her breath shallow. Then she whispered the question she was probably most afraid of. What happens to me now? Robert answered her, his tone gentle but firm. The board is voting to suspend your position pending a final legal review. Vanessa stared at him, unable to comprehend. You can't do that. I assure you we can. Her eyes darted desperately to Michael. Say something. My son looked completely devastated, but this time he didn't stay silent. I can't protect you from this anymore.
Those words broke her completely. Vanessa stepped back slowly, as if she had been physically struck. Then, without another word, she grabbed her bag and walked out of the boardroom. Nobody stopped her. The silence that followed her departure was massive. Michael stared at the closed door for a long time.
I watched my son carefully then, because the loss of an illusion hurts almost as much as the loss of a loved one. Finally, he whispered, almost to himself. I didn't realize things had gotten this bad. I looked at him sadly. Sometimes people don't realize a house is on fire because they've gotten used to living in the smoke. By Friday morning, the story had exploded across national business media. Before the sun was even up, headlines dominated television screens and social media feeds. Luxury executive outed in corporate scandal. Mysterious hotel owner emerges after public gala. The standoff. Housekeeper reveals herself as multi-billion hotel founder. And worst of all, for Vanessa, executive accused of calling staff liabilities. The internet devours stories like this, especially stories about arrogance collapsing in public. I sat quietly in my kitchen watching the morning news, a cup of coffee growing cold and untouched beside me. Every channel replayed the footage from the gala on a loop. Vanessa's shocked face. The applause after Robert introduced me. The moment Marcus confirmed the signature on the checks. Pundits analysed everyone's body language, like they were dissecting courtroom evidence. But beneath all the noise, something else bothered me. People weren't talking about humanity. They were talking about the spectacle. That is how modern culture handles pain. It turns it into entertainment. My phone rang continuously. Board members, investors, reporters, old friends I hadn't spoken to in years. I ignored most of them. Then Margaret called. She's doing an interview publicly, she said without preamble. I closed my eyes briefly. Of course she was. What is she saying? She gave a statement earlier this morning. Margaret hesitated. She claims you orchestrated a public humiliation campaign against her. I let out a soft laugh, though nothing felt funny anymore. Anything else? She implied that the family has been manipulating her from the very beginning. That part stung, unexpectedly. Not because it damaged me, but because, deep down, I knew Vanessa genuinely believed it. Pain distorts memory, especially when responsibility is involved. Margaret let out a quiet breath. Robert wants to do a formal joint press conference this afternoon. No, a pause. No, I'll do it myself. The line went quiet for a moment. Then Margaret replied softly, Richard would be so proud of you today.
That comment nearly brought me to tears.
The press conference was set for 4 p.m. in the main ballroom of the flagship hotel. The exact same ballroom where everything had broken open days prior. By 3:30, reporters were packed shoulder to shoulder outside the lobby entrance. Camera flashes reflected off the marble floors, and hotel security struggled to contain the wall of noise. In a private preparation room upstairs, Michael stood by the window, staring silently out at the Chicago skyline. He looked exhausted. He hadn't slept much all week. Neither had I. When I walked in, he whispered, "You don't have to face this alone." I offered a small smile. "Neither do you." For a few seconds, we just stood together in the quiet. Then Michael spoke again. "Vanessa moved out last night." The sadness in his voice nearly broke my heart. Not because I missed Vanessa, but because I hated watching my son mourn the life he thought he had. "Are you okay?" I asked gently. He let out a soft, bitter laugh. "No, to be honest." "Good. That's where the healing starts." Michael rubbed his forehead, looking exhausted. "She said I betrayed her." I looked at him carefully. "What do you think?" He swallowed hard. "I think I betrayed everyone else." That answer carried more maturity than I had heard from him in years. Before I could respond, a staff member knocked gently on the door. "Mrs. Perez, they're ready for you." The ballroom downstairs fell completely silent as I stepped onto the podium. Under the bright television lights, hundreds of reporters stared back at me. The shutter clicks of cameras were a steady, deafening hum. The questions were already written in their eyes. I moved slowly behind the microphone, while Michael stood a few feet away near the side of the stage. For a moment, I just looked at the room. Then I began. "My name is Penelope Perez." My voice carried softly through the ballroom. "After my husband passed away, I stepped away from the public eye for many years." The room remained absolutely still. Richard Perez believed that a business must take care of its people before it ever pursues profit. I paused. And somewhere along the way, our company lost its direction. Reporters scribbled furiously. Camera lights blinked. A journalist immediately raised his hand. "Mrs. Perez, did you intentionally hide your ownership from your daughter-in-law?" "I hid my ownership from almost everyone." "Why?" I thought about it carefully. "Because grief changes a person." The ballroom grew even quieter. For a long time after my husband died, I didn't recognize myself. But working quietly in our hotels reminded me of exactly who we built this company for. Another reporter called out, "Is it true you worked in housekeeping for years?" "Yes." A murmur immediately rippled through the crowd. "Why would a majority owner clean hotel rooms?" I smiled sadly, because there is dignity in honest labor. A complete silence followed that answer. An older journalist slowly lowered his notepad. Before more questions could disrupt the moment, I continued. "The employees of Perez Grand Hotels are not transparent. They are not disposable, and they are certainly not liabilities." Several staff members standing against the ballroom walls began crying quietly. I saw Angela among them. Another reporter stood up. "Vanessa Carter Perez claims she was publicly humiliated. What is your response to that?" The question hung heavy in the room. I could have destroyed Vanessa right there. I could have listed every single improper expense, every insult, every cruel act. Instead, I took a deep breath. I believe that pain often turns people into versions of themselves they no longer recognize. The room held its breath. "I don't hate Vanessa." That clearly surprised people. "She grew up in terror of being powerless," I continued gently. "Unfortunately, the way some people handle fear is by trying to control others." A young reporter frowned. "So you forgive her?" "Forgiveness, what a complicated word." "I believe accountability and compassion can exist in the same space." That answer felt closest to the truth. Then, something unexpected happened. Michael stepped up to the microphone beside me. The ballroom immediately erupted into whispers. My son looked terrified, but resolute. He faced the cameras slowly. "My mother deserved better from me." Every single reporter in the room went quiet. Michael swallowed hard and continued. "I saw behavior years ago that I should have stopped, but I stayed silent because I was afraid of conflict." His voice cracked slightly. "That silence hurt the staff. It hurt my family, and it hurt my mother most of all." My eyes welled with tears instantly, because this wasn't polished, it wasn't rehearsed, it was entirely real. Michael turned to me briefly. "I am deeply sorry." The ballroom was entirely still. Somewhere in the back rows, I heard someone crying softly. Finally, a reporter asked quietly, "Mrs. Perez, after everything that has happened, what matters most to you now?" I looked carefully around the ballroom, at the journalists, at the staff, at the cameras, at the company Richard and I had built from nothing. Finally, I answered with total sincerity. "I want people to remember that success means absolutely nothing if you lose your humanity to achieve it." Dead silence. Then applause started quietly somewhere in the back. Not loud, dramatic applause. Soft, human applause. Standing under those crystal chandeliers amid the flashing camera lights, next to my son, Paris Grand Hotels finally felt like ours again for the first time in years. 3 weeks after the press conference, the penthouse didn't look impressive anymore. It looked lonely. The massive windows still overlooked the Chicago skyline. The marble floors still reflected the city lights after dark. The expensive art still lined the white walls perfectly. But luxury without warmth feels terribly empty. Vanessa sat alone at the kitchen island, wearing an oversized sweater instead of a designer dress. Her face, completely free of makeup, looked remarkably tired in a way I had never seen before. There were no photographers, no investors, no assistants trailing behind her with coffee and schedules. Just quiet. It is funny how quickly people disappear when status goes away.
Several magazines had already replaced her in features on women in luxury business with newer, younger executives. Former social circle friends suddenly stopped returning her calls. The invitations vanished almost overnight. Even the internet had moved on. For most people, a scandal is just temporary entertainment, but the consequences remain.
Rain tapped against the glass as Vanessa stared blankly at her untouched glass of wine. Michael had officially moved out 4 days ago. There had been no screaming, no hysteria, no broken plates. Just exhaustion. He had quietly packed 2 suitcases and left before sunrise. That kind of ending hurts worse. The apartment intercom suddenly buzzed. Vanessa frowned. She wasn't expecting anyone anymore. Most people only visited the penthouse when it represented something useful. She pressed the button irritably. "Who is it?" "It's Penelope."
Silence, long silence, then come up.
When the elevator doors opened, I almost didn't recognize her. Vanessa used to walk into a room like she was performing a display of confidence. Even her posture used to demand attention. Now she looked somehow smaller, like a regular person. Seeing me walk in, she pulled her arms tightly around herself. "I assume you're here to finish the process of humiliating me." I slowly removed my gloves. "If I wanted to humiliate you, Vanessa, I would have used very different words at that press conference." Vanessa let out a bitter laugh. "That was your mercy?" "Yes." The answer immediately unsettled her. She looked away, toward the city lights. The penthouse felt colder than usual. Not physically, but emotionally. I looked around quietly. Richard used to say, houses absorb the energy of the people who live in them. This place had absorbed tension, fear, performance. Vanessa crossed her arms tighter. "Michael told me you stopped the layoffs." "I did, and I expanded the medical coverage." "Right." Her jaw tightened slightly. "That's not how the corporate world operates these days." I watched her closely. "No," I said softly, "but that is how a good business operates." She didn't answer. For a long while, there was only the sound of the rain tapping lightly against the glass and the city blinking below us. Then Vanessa spoke again suddenly. "Do you know what the worst part is?" I waited. I genuinely thought people respected me. There it was. That was the real wound. Not the money, not the status. The validation of self-worth. Vanessa walked slowly toward the kitchen counter. "They're all gone," she whispered. "Every single one of them." I studied her carefully. When people love your image instead of your character, they leave the moment the image breaks. Vanessa let out a quiet, tearful chuckle. "You sound like a therapist." "No," I smiled sadly. "Just old." The comment almost made her smile. Almost. "When I was 13, she said softly, leaning against the counter and looking down at her glass. "The power in my house was shut off for 2 weeks.
I remained quiet.
My mother hid in the bathroom and cried because she couldn't pay the bill." Her voice sounded distant now, as if it were coming from far away. I remember promising myself that I would never experience that feeling of powerlessness again. The pain settled quietly in the room. Not dramatic pain, but the tired kind that people carry for years without realizing it's controlling them. "I understand that fear," I said gently. Vanessa snapped her head up. "No, you don't." "I do." She shook her head instantly. "You had Richard. You had money." I took a slow step closer. "When Richard and I opened our first motel, we shared a single winter coat because we couldn't afford 2. That made her pause. "We cleaned the rooms ourselves," I continued, "sometimes until 3 in the morning." Vanessa stared at me. I know exactly what fear feels like. The room fell silent again before she whispered softly, "Then why do you hate me?" The question stung unexpectedly because deep down she really believed it. I shook my head slowly. I have never hated you, Vanessa. You do. No, my voice softened. I hated watching you become cruel. Her eyes went red instantly. You judged me. I pitied you. That broke something inside her. Vanessa looked away quickly, tears escaping down her cheeks before she could stop them. You don't know what it's like to be looked down on. I thought about the laundry room, the housekeeping cart, the freight elevator, and the word trash. Then I answered honestly. I do now. She closed her eyes. For a few seconds, only the rain filled the silence between us. Then Vanessa finally spoke the truth that had been hidden beneath everything else. I was jealous of you. I frowned slightly. Of me? You always seemed so peaceful. Her voice cracked. Even when people ignored you. I understood then. Vanessa had mistaken internal peace for weakness because she had never learned how to create peace for herself on the inside. Instead, she spent her whole life performing her worth on the outside. I spent years trying to be someone important, she admitted shakily. And somehow you just walk into any room with that presence without even trying. The comment nearly broke my heart because she still didn't completely understand. True dignity has nothing to do with wealth. It comes from how you treat people who can offer you absolutely nothing in return. I sat down slowly across from her. Vanessa, she wiped her cheeks angrily. I know I ruined everything. I considered it. No, I said softly, not everything.
She let out a bitter laugh. Michael left. He needs space. He hates me. I thought about my son. No, I answered honestly. Michael hates who he became around you.
The silence that followed felt important, because it was true. Vanessa looked slowly around the empty penthouse. None of this feels like it matters anymore. Following her gaze, I swept my eyes across the luxury apartment. The chandeliers, the marble, the skyline, the expensive emptiness. Then I softly repeated the words Richard had told me during our poorest years. Musha without kindness always ends up lonely. Vanessa stared at me silently, and for the first time since I had known her, she wasn't defending herself. She was listening. Truly listening. I don't know how to start over, she whispered. I looked at the terrified woman sitting across from me. She wasn't an executive, or a socialite, or the villain the internet hated. She was just a hurt person who had built an identity to escape shame. And suddenly I understood a painful truth. People who are terrified of being humiliated often become experts at humiliating others first. I stood up slowly and grabbed my coat. Before leaving, I walked over to her one last time. Start by learning to see people before you judge them. Tears rolled silently down her cheeks. I patted her shoulder gently. Not because she had entirely earned forgiveness. Not yet. But because hatred destroys the person who carries it just as much. Then I walked out of the penthouse, leaving the rain falling over the Chicago skyline behind me. And for the first time in a very long time, Vanessa Carter Perez sat alone with nothing left to hide behind but the truth. Spring came quietly that year. After months of ice and grey skies, Chicago finally softened, thawing out bit by bit. Sidewalk cafes opened up again. The trees along Michigan Avenue began to show hints of green. People smiled more easily when the sun returned. Healing feels a bit like that too, slow, uneven, but hopeful. 6 months after the gala, Perez Grand hotels looked different, not flashier, but human. The first major policy change I approved was expanding health coverage for long-term employees. The retirement support was strengthened. Staff recognition bonuses returned for the first time in years. Best of all, executives were now required to spend 1 week every year working directly in operations. Housekeeping, laundry, kitchen service, front desk, no exceptions. Marcus joked that half the corporate team nearly fainted after moving luggage carts for an afternoon. Good. People should understand the labour that supports their comfort. I still visited the flagship hotel often, though not in secret anymore. And strangely, the staff treated me almost exactly the same as before. Angela still scolded me for skipping lunch. Maria still slipped homemade cookies into my bag. The only difference now was that people didn't apologize for existing around management anymore. That mattered more than anyone realized. On a warm Thursday afternoon, I walked through the lobby and noticed Michael helping an older couple carry their bags near the front desk. I paused quietly. 6 months ago, my son would have delegated that task immediately. Now he was smiling, personally guiding them to the elevator. When he finally noticed me, a faint look of embarrassment crossed his face. "What?" he asked, slightly defensive. I smiled. "Your father used to carry luggage too." That brought a soft laugh from him. Michael had changed slowly after Vanessa left. Not dramatically. True growth rarely is dramatic. He attended therapy, stepped back from the heavy executive workload, and started listening more in staff meetings instead of hiding behind silence.
Sometimes grief matures people after breaking them completely. Other times it hardens them forever. I was grateful my son had chosen the first path.
"Coffee later?" he asked. "I'd love that." As we spoke, I noticed several young employees looking at Michael with a quiet respect rather than fear. That was new too. Respect earned through honesty is always much quieter than authority demanded through shouting. Later that afternoon, I drove across town to a small non-profit community centre in the south side of Chicago. The building wasn't much to look at. Peeling paint, old brick, a cramped parking lot. But when I arrived, laughter floated out of the open windows. Inside, volunteers were organising food boxes for low-income families, while children coloured at nearby folding tables. And near the supply shelves, wearing jeans and no makeup, was Vanessa. For a moment she didn't see me. She was kneeling next to a little girl, helping her carefully tidy up a damaged cardboard box. The child suddenly hugged her, and Vanessa let out a surprised, soft laugh. A real laugh. Not manicured, not rehearsed. Human. Then she looked up and saw me. Shock flashed briefly across her face before she stood up. "Penelope." "Hello, Vanessa."
She tucked her hair behind her ear nervously. No designer dress, no icy assistance or orchestrated image. She still looked tired, but somehow lighter.
A coordinator from the non-profit walked over, smiling. "Vanessa's been saving our budget," she told me proudly. "She completely restructured our donation tracking." Vanessa looked down, suddenly embarrassed. "It's nothing." No, actually, it wasn't nothing. That was the whole point. After the coordinator walked away, we stood awkwardly near the shelves. Finally, Vanessa spoke softly. "I heard about the employee reforms. We're working on it." She nodded slowly. "I'm glad." There was sincerity in her voice now. That mattered. Not because redemption erases harm, but because growth requires honesty first. I looked around the centre. "You look different here." Vanessa let out a quiet laugh. "I think this is the first job I've ever had where nobody cares what I look like." "How does it feel?" She thought about it carefully. "Terrifying." Then a faint smile appeared. "But peaceful." I knew exactly what she meant. There is freedom when you stop needing to constantly perform to prove your worth. Vanessa folded her arms loosely. "Michael told me you asked the board not to pursue legal action against me." I nodded once. She looked down immediately. "You didn't owe me that." "No." The silence fell gently between us. Then Vanessa whispered the words I never truly expected to hear. "I'm sorry." Not dramatic, not defensive, just honest. "I was cruel to you," she continued softly, "and to people who didn't deserve it." My chest tightened slightly. I spent so much time trying to feel strong that I forgot how to be decent. The old Vanessa would have never admitted that. I looked at her closely. "I believe people can change," I said.
She smiled sadly. "Even after everything?"
"Yes. Why?" I thought about Richard, about grief, about Michael crying at my kitchen table, about Angela's husband surviving his treatments, about how easily hurt people hurt others. Then I answered truthfully, because if we stop believing people can change, then bitterness is the only future we have left. Vanessa's eyes filled with tears immediately. This time she didn't hide them. Outside the windows of the community centre, the evening sun bathed the city in a warm light. For the first time since this all began, peace settled quietly in my heart. Not a perfect peace. Life never gives you that, but enough. Before turning to leave, I looked at Vanessa one last time. "You know," I said gently, "Richard always believed that the true measure of wealth had nothing to do with money." She wiped away a tear carefully. "What did he think it was?" I smiled softly. "It's how many people feel safer when you walk into the room." Vanessa wept harder at that, and to be honest, so did I. That evening, Michael joined me for dinner at my small brick house in the suburbs. Nothing grand, just soup, bread, and coffee afterward. At one point, he looked around the kitchen and smiled slightly.
"You know," he admitted, "I used to think success meant escaping places like this."
I reached across the table and squeezed his hand gently. "And now?" Michael looked around the small, warm kitchen, quietly. Then he smiled. Now I think this might be the wealthiest house I know. Outside, the spring rain tapped lightly against the glass, while laughter echoed in the kitchen for the first time in years. Somewhere deep down, I finally understood what Richard had been trying to teach us all along. Money can build a hotel, but kindness is what makes it a home. After everything that happened, I spent a long time thinking about how easily we judge each other based solely on appearances. A housekeeper's uniform, an old car, a quiet woman standing in the corner of a room. So many people looked at me and decided my worth before they ever knew my story. But life has a strange way of revealing the truth over time. The people who scream the loudest about power are often the ones most terrified of losing it. And the ones who look the most ordinary sometimes carry the greatest strength. What happened to my family taught me something I will never forget. Kindness is never weakness. True power isn't about controlling people, humiliating them, or making others feel small so you can feel important. True power is choosing dignity even when you are hurting. It's protecting people when nobody is watching. It's remembering that whether someone is a worker, a stranger, or a family member, they are a person first. I also learned that silence can cut just as deeply as cruelty. My son loved me, but he stayed silent for too long because he was afraid of conflict. And fear, left unchecked, quietly erodes relationships until it's almost too late. But healing is possible. Not perfect healing, and not instant forgiveness. Real healing is much slower than that. It begins the moment people finally speak the truth, take responsibility, and decide to be better than they were yesterday. If there is one thing I want you to take away from this story, it is this. Never measure a person's worth by their job title, their age, or their social standing. Some of the strongest, wisest, and most generous people in this world are the ones who get overlooked every single day. And sometimes the person being ignored is the one holding everything together. If this story touched your heart, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever been unfairly judged or underestimated by others? What do you think matters more in life? Success or kindness? Don't forget to let me know where you are watching from and what time it is where you are. I read so many of your comments, and your stories mean the world to me. If you love emotional family dramas with a deep lesson and a moving conclusion, please give this a like, subscribe,
And join me. I will see you very soon in the next story.